Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The fox slipped like a red ghost through the morning mist. I lifted my coffee mug to my lips, letting the steam warm my face in the cool Alabama spring air. The animal paused, its ears twitching, and I set my mug down on the porch railing. This was my chance. I grabbed my camera from the side table and stepped off my back porch. The dew-soaked grass dampened my boots as I moved across my backyard toward the field behind my house. The fox hadn't noticed me yet. I kept my footsteps light, breathing slow and measured. My name's Dale Boswell. I've lived in Phoenix City my whole life, and May mornings like this one were what kept me here. Peaceful, quiet, with wildlife practically in my backyard. I'd been trying to photograph that particular fox for weeks. It had a distinctive white-tipped tail and seemed to follow the same route most mornings, trotting along the edge of my property before disappearing into the woods that bordered my neighbor Jim's hunting land. The fox trotted ahead of me, stopping occasionally to sniff at something in the tall grass. I followed at a distance, moving slower than usual, careful not to snap any twigs or rustle through the brush. For once, I was quiet enough that the fox didn't bolt. It just kept moving toward the tree line, and I kept following. The morning sun had broken through the mist now, casting long shadows across the field. The time on my watch read 7:23 a.m. I'd give myself another 15 minutes before heading back to get ready for work. I had a doctor's appointment later that day, too. Just a routine checkup. The fox disappeared into the brush at the edge of the woods. I walked a bit further, reaching the barbed wire fence that marked the boundary between my land and Jim's hunting property. I stopped there, not wanting to trespass. The fence posts were weathered grey, the wire rusted in spots. I'd been meaning to talk to Jim about replacing it together, but hadn't gotten around to it. I decided to just enjoy the quiet morning for a minute. The sun felt good on my face. Birds called from the trees. A light breeze rustled the new spring leaves. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and looked down the fence line. That's when I saw it. Movement caught my eye about 150 feet to my left, where the fence line met a narrow dirt trail that cut through the woods. Something black moved along the trail. At first, I thought it might be a person. Maybe Jim or one of his kids out checking their trail cameras, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. This thing moved wrong. It glided along the trail, perfectly upright on two legs, but with an unnatural smoothness. Despite the uneven ground, it moved as if it were on invisible rails or being pulled along by wires. No bounce, no natural gait, no footsteps I could detect. The figure leaned forward at a 15 or 20 degree angle, like a skier in a downhill position. But it was moving on flat ground. Its head was too large for its body and tilted back slightly. The body was thin, with an unusually high waist and short legs, completely, utterly black. Not black clothing, but black like a shadow with substance. It moved fast, too fast for me to call out or react. 5 seconds, maybe less, and it had crossed the sunny patch of trail and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. I stood frozen, my camera forgotten in my hands. Then it hit me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. My legs went weak. I couldn't catch my breath. It felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen from the air around me. My head swam and blood rushed to my face. My eyes welled up with tears for no reason. The weird thing was, I wasn't consciously afraid. I'd seen something strange, sure, but my mind hadn't processed fear yet. My body, though, my body knew something wasn't right. It was responding with pure animal panic. I tried to get my phone out of my pocket, but my fingers fumbled uselessly. My familiar backyard suddenly looked miles away. The distance between where I stood and my house seemed impossibly vast. I felt completely disoriented, like I was in a place I'd never been before, even though I was on my own property. "What the hell?" I gasped. My voice sounded distant in my own ears. I finally managed to unlock my phone, but couldn't remember what I wanted to do with it. Call someone? Take a picture? The screen swam before my eyes. I somehow got the camera app open and hit record, pointing it at my own face. "I just saw something," I panted into the camera. "I can't breathe. Jesus Christ, I can't breathe." My voice sounded strained and weak. I could hear myself gasping for air, the camera shaking wildly in my trembling hand. With my free hand, I fumbled through my contacts and called the only person I could think of, Matt Keener, a buddy of mine who'd been researching Bigfoot sightings in the area for years. I'd always laughed at his hobby, but now I wasn't laughing. Matt answered on the third ring. "Dale, what's up, man?" "Matt!" I gasped. "I saw something, in the woods, by Jim's place." "Whoa, slow down," he said. "Are you okay? You sound like you're having a heart attack." "Can't breathe," I managed. "Saw something. Black, moving wrong." "Where are you right now?" Matt's voice turned serious. "Field behind my house, near the fence line." "Can you get back to your house?" I looked toward my house. It seemed impossibly far away, though I knew it couldn't be more than a couple 100 yards. "Don't know," I said. "Just start walking, Dale. Stay on the phone with me." I turned and took a stumbling step toward home. My legs felt like rubber. "I'm walking," I told Matt. "Something's wrong with me. I'm not right." "Just keep talking to me," Matt said. "What exactly did you see?" I described the black figure as I staggered through the field. Telling him about it made my chest tighten again, but his calm voice on the other end of the line helped ground me. "Have you ever felt like this before?" Matt asked. "Never," I gasped. "I've had panic attacks before, but nothing like this. This is different. My body just reacted." Matt started telling me about infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that some animals can produce. Tigers use it to paralyze prey. Some researchers think certain cryptids might use it too. I barely registered what he was saying. My house was getting closer, but I still felt detached from reality. The ground under my feet didn't feel solid. The familiar landmarks of my property looked wrong somehow, too far, too close, distorted. I reached my back porch and nearly collapsed onto the steps. My wife Linda appeared in the doorway, her face shifting from irritation to concern in an instant. "Dale, what happened?" She rushed down the steps. "Thanks, Matt," I mumbled into the phone. "I'm home now." I hung up and let the phone drop onto the wooden porch. Linda knelt beside me, her nurse's training kicking in. She pressed her fingers to my wrist, checking my pulse. "Your heart's racing," she said. "What happened? Did you run back here?" I shook my head. "Saw something in the woods." Even saying that much made my chest tighten again. Linda helped me inside and sat me on the couch. She brought me water and made me put my head between my knees when I started to feel lightheaded again. "You're having an anxiety attack," she said, rubbing circles on my back. "Just breathe, Dale, slow and steady." I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came out jumbled. Linda didn't push it. She just sat with me until my breathing steadied, though my hands continued to shake. "You still have that doctor's appointment at 3, she reminded me. "Maybe you should mention this." I nodded, still not trusting myself to speak much. The rest of the morning passed in a daze. I called in sick to work. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I looked out the windows toward the woods, I saw that black figure in my mind, gliding, wrong, impossible. By the time we left for my doctor's appointment, I felt physically better, but mentally exhausted. Linda drove. I stared out the window, jumping at every shadow we passed. At the clinic, the nurse took my vitals and frowned at the blood pressure reading. She took it again, still high. "Your blood pressure is 168/110, she said. That's significantly elevated. Dr. Reynolds came in a few minutes later, glancing at my chart with concern. "What's going on, Dale? Your blood pressure's never been this high before." Linda spoke up when I hesitated. "He had some kind of panic attack this morning. Found him on the back porch, barely able to breathe." Dr. Reynolds looked at me over his glasses. "Want to tell me what happened?" I took a deep breath. "I was out behind the house taking pictures. I saw something—" I paused, not wanting to sound crazy. "I saw something I can't explain, like a person, but not a person, moving wrong." I described the figure again and the physical reaction I'd had. To his credit, Dr. Reynolds didn't laugh or dismiss me. He just nodded and made notes. "The physical symptoms you're describing are consistent with an extreme fight-or-flight response," he said. "Your body perceived a threat and flooded your system with adrenaline and cortisol. That explains the racing heart, difficulty breathing, disorientation." "But I wasn't scared," I insisted. "Not at first. My body reacted before my brain did." Dr. Reynolds nodded again. "That happens. Our bodies sometimes know something's wrong before our conscious mind processes it." He paused. "What do you think you saw?" I shook my head. "I don't know. Dr. Reynolds wrote something in my chart. I caught the words claimed Bigfoot sighting and almost protested, but stopped myself. I didn't know what I'd seen. He prescribed medication to lower my blood pressure and suggested I follow up in a week. He also recommended I talk to someone about the experience, a therapist maybe. "Even if we can't explain what you saw," he said, "the physical and emotional impact is real. That needs to be addressed." On the drive home, Linda was quiet for a while before asking, "Do you want to tell me exactly what happened this morning?" I described the whole experience again, following the fox, seeing the black figure, the overwhelming physical reaction. Linda listened without interrupting. "You know what's strange?" I said. "I wasn't afraid of it. It didn't do anything threatening. It didn't even notice me. But my body just shut down." "Matt mentioned something about infrasound on the phone," I continued. "Animals that can produce low-frequency sound waves to disorient prey. Tigers do it. Elephants too." Linda glanced at me. "You think this thing did that to you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But something happened to me physically that I can't explain." When we got home, I avoided the backyard. I couldn't look at the woods without seeing that black figure gliding across the trail. Linda made dinner, and we ate in silence. After, I called Matt back and gave him more details about what I'd seen. "I've heard similar descriptions before," Matt said. "The unnatural movement, the physical reactions, especially the feeling of disorientation and the difficulty breathing." "You believe me?" I asked. "I believe you saw something," Matt said carefully, "and I believe it affected you physically in a way that science doesn't fully explain yet." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that black figure. Linda held me as I tossed and turned, my heart occasionally racing for no reason, sweat soaking the sheets despite the cool night. In the following days, I researched similar encounters. There were dozens of accounts from across the country, black figures moving with unnatural smoothness, witnesses experiencing extreme physical distress afterward. Some researchers called them shadow people or glimmer men. Others classified them as interdimensional beings or forest spirits. None of the explanations satisfied me, but the similarities in the accounts were undeniable. These weren't just hallucinations. People's bodies reacted to these encounters in measurable, documented ways. A week later, my blood pressure was still elevated at my follow-up appointment. Dr. Reynolds adjusted my medication and asked if I'd had any more sightings. I hadn't, but I still couldn't look at the woods behind my house. Jim came over one day to talk about the fence. We stood on my back deck, and I couldn't help staring at the spot where I'd seen the figure. "You okay, Dale?" Jim asked. "You seem jumpy." I almost told him, but stopped myself. Instead, I asked, "You ever see anything strange in those woods? Anything you couldn't explain?" Jim gave me an odd look. "Can't say that I have. Why?" I shrugged. "No reason." But there was a reason. Whatever I'd seen that morning in May had changed something in me. I'd encountered something that existed outside my understanding of the world, something that my rational mind couldn't process, but my body recognized as fundamentally wrong. I still go outside, I still take pictures, but I don't follow foxes into the field anymore. And whenever I look toward that section of woods, the memory replays in my mind with perfect clarity. That black figure gliding along the trail, moving wrong, impossible. Science can't explain what I saw, but my body remembers. And somewhere in those woods, I know that Phantom still moves on its invisible rails, tilted forward like a skier, head too large and tipped backward, gliding through Phoenix City as it has perhaps for years, decades, centuries. Most people will never see it. Those who do will carry the memory forever, imprinted on their consciousness like a brand. I am one of those people now, and all I can do is tell my story and hope that someone, somewhere, can make sense of what happened to me on that May morning in 2018, the day I met the Phantom of Phoenix City. Story 2. The August heat pressed down on us as we unloaded our gear from the truck. I'd been looking forward to this hunting trip with Tyler and Derek for months. After 2 tours in Vietnam and 15 years on the police force in Grand Junction, these annual excursions into Colorado's wilderness were my sanctuary. My name is Marcus Reed, and this would be my last hunting trip. "Think we'll bag that 12-pointer this year, Marcus?" Tyler Brooks grinned, adjusting his police department cap. At 42, Sergeant Tyler was the youngest of our trio, but had proven himself countless times during our previous expeditions. "If you can actually hit something this time," Lieutenant Derek Foster chuckled, hoisting his pack with practiced ease. At 54, Derek and I had seen combat together before joining law enforcement. His silver hair betrayed his age, but his 6'2" frame remained imposing. We established our base camp near the ridge of Sleepy Cat Peak, a remote area about 30 miles from the nearest town. The location offered a commanding view of the densely wooded valley below, virgin territory for hunters, according to the locals. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines as we set up our 2 tents and organized our supplies. "Should have time for a quick scout before dark," Tyler suggested, checking his watch. "Get the lay of the land." I nodded. "Derek, you mind holding down the fort while we take a look?" Derek waved us off. "Go ahead, I'll get dinner started. Don't be out after sundown. Supposed to storm tonight." Tyler and I grabbed our rifles and headed down the slope into the valley. The initial descent was pleasant enough. Golden hour sunlight dappled through the trees, the familiar crunch of pine needles beneath our boots. We walked for maybe 45 minutes, making mental notes of game trails and possible blind locations for the morning hunt. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. "Tyler," I said, stopping abruptly. "Listen." He paused, head tilted slightly. "I don't hear anything." Exactly. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing. In 25 years of hunting, I'd never experienced such absolute stillness in the woods. "Probably just a mountain lion passed through recently," Tyler offered, but his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on for another 10 minutes, but the silence grew more oppressive with each step. Then came the cold. Not a natural cooling as evening approached, but a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The air felt wrong, heavy, like something was pressing against my chest. "We should head back," I said, surprised by the tremor in my voice. Tyler didn't argue. He'd felt it too. As we turned to climb back toward camp, I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. Something was watching us. I knew it with absolute certainty. The same gut feeling that had saved my life in Nam. I scanned our surroundings, but saw nothing unusual among the trees. "Let's pick up the pace," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The climb back took half the time of our descent. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. By the time our camp came into view, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the unnatural chill in the air. Derek stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down at the valley we'd just fled. "You feel it too," Derek said, not a question. I nodded, catching my breath. "Something's down there." Tyler arrived seconds later, face flushed from our hurried return. "What the hell was that about?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew the answer. The three of us stood there, watching as shadows lengthened across the valley. The setting sun cast the trees in blood-red light. Still, the unnatural silence persisted, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder. "Should we pack up?" Tyler asked. "Head back to town?" Derek checked his watch. "Storm's coming in. We'd never make it down the mountain before dark. Better to wait till morning." I agreed, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. "We're armed. We've got shelter. Whatever's down there, it can stay down there." We ate dinner in uncomfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The first raindrops began to fall as we secured our gear and prepared to turn in for the night. Derek and I shared the larger tent, with Tyler taking the smaller one about 15 feet away. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake, listening to the increasing patter of rain on canvas, occasionally illuminated by distant lightning. Derek's breathing eventually slowed into the rhythm of sleep beside me, but my eyes remained fixed on the tent ceiling. My watch read 1:27 a.m. when everything changed. The scream tore through the night, a sound so fundamentally wrong it defied description. It started almost human, high-pitched and desperate, then twisted into something else, a growl that vibrated through the ground beneath us, ending in a chest-rattling snarl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Derek bolted upright beside me, his .357 Magnum already in his hand. "Jesus Christ," he hissed. I had my 9mm drawn too, heart hammering against my ribs. We heard Tyler's zipper frantically opening across the way. "What the fuck was that?" Tyler's voice carried through the rain, tight with fear. "Stay in your tent," Derek commanded. "Both of you, weapons ready." Another scream ripped through the darkness, closer this time. Much closer, just outside our tents. The sound paralyzed me completely, not just with fear, but with the absolute knowledge that whatever made that noise wasn't something that should exist in our world. "I can hear it moving," Tyler whispered from his tent. He was right. Despite the rain, I could make out the sound of something large circling our camp. The footfalls were strange, not the heavy plodding of a bear or the soft padding of a mountain lion. They were deliberate, precise, the stride too long for any animal I knew. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the campsite through the tent fabric. In that fraction of a second, I saw a silhouette against Tyler's tent, tall, unnaturally thin and completely motionless. "There's something right outside," I whispered to Derek, who nodded, his face ashen in the dim light. "I see it too," Tyler's voice came, barely audible now. "It's just standing there." For 3 hours, we remained frozen in our positions, weapons trained on the tent openings. The creature, whatever it was, continued to circle our camp, sometimes coming close enough that I could hear its breathing, a wet, rattling sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Other times, it seemed to retreat, only to return minutes later. Around 4:30 a.m., during a brief lull in the storm, Derek made a decision. "Tyler," he called out softly, "on my count, we're going to make a run for the truck." "What? It's still out there," Tyler protested. "It's toying with us," Derek replied. "We need to move while we can still see a little. Marcus and I will go first, provide cover. You follow 5 seconds after." My mouth went dry. The truck was parked about 30 yards from our tents, 30 yards of open ground. But Derek was right. Whatever this thing was, it could have attacked already if it wanted to. It was playing with us, and I'd rather die running than cowering in a tent. "Ready?" I whispered, positioning myself at the tent opening. Derek counted down from 3. We burst from the tent, weapons raised, scanning the darkness. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the first hints of pre-dawn light allowed us to make out the truck's silhouette. I saw nothing moving in the immediate vicinity. "Go!" Derek shouted to Tyler. We reached the truck, fumbling with the keys as Tyler sprinted toward us. That's when we heard it, the sound of something moving fast, very fast, through the underbrush to our right. "Get in!" I yelled, throwing open the passenger door as Derek started the engine. Tyler was 10 yards away when another lightning flash revealed what was chasing him. I caught only a glimpse, something pale and gaunt, moving on all fours with impossible speed. Tyler must have seen it too, because he let out a strangled cry and ran faster than I'd ever seen a man move. He practically dove through the open door as Derek gunned the engine. I slammed the door shut just as something heavy crashed into the side of the truck. The whole vehicle rocked with the impact. "Go, go, go!" Tyler screamed. Derek floored it, the truck fishtailing on the muddy ground before gaining traction. As we sped away, I looked back through the rear window. Another lightning flash illuminated the campsite. Our tents were shredded, equipment scattered across the ground. Standing in the center of the destruction was a figure. It stood upright now, impossibly tall and thin. I couldn't make out details in the brief illumination, just a vague humanoid shape with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Then darkness again. We drove without stopping, without speaking, until we hit the main highway. The sun was fully up by then, the storm having moved east. None of us suggested going back for our abandoned gear. At a diner in the nearest town, we finally broke our silence over cups of coffee that none of us drank. "We need to report this," Tyler said finally. Derek shook his head. "Report what? That we heard weird noises and got spooked by a storm? We didn't see anything clearly." "I saw it," I said quietly. Both men looked at me. "Not clearly, but enough. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't anything that's supposed to exist." Tyler nodded slowly. "The sound it made. I'll never forget that sound." We eventually agreed on a story. That we'd been driven off the mountain by the storm and would return for our gear later. None of us ever did. Whatever waited in those woods, it had marked us somehow. We all felt it, a lingering connection, as if the thing might follow us home if we drew too much attention to it. Tyler was the first to sell his hunting gear. Derek and I followed suit within the month. None of us ever ventured into remote woods again. That was 42 years ago. Derek passed away in 1998. Heart attack, the doctor said, though his wife told me he'd woken screaming about something outside their bedroom window the night he died. Tyler moved to Arizona in the early 2000s, and I lost touch with him until I received a letter last year. It contained only a newspaper clipping about unusual animal attacks near Sleepy Cat Peak and a handwritten note, "It's still there." I'm 78 now, too old to run if I hear that scream again. Some nights, when the wind blows just right through the trees behind my house, I think I catch fragments of it, that impossible sound that started human and ended as something else. I keep my old 9mm loaded in my bedside drawer. Not that it would do any good. Whatever hunted us that night in 1981 wasn't something bullets could stop. It was ancient and patient and hungry in ways I'll never understand. And sometimes, on stormy nights like tonight, I swear I can hear footsteps circling my house. Deliberate, precise, with a stride too long for anything human. Story 3. I jolted awake to the trailer rocking beneath me. Not the gentle sway from wind gusts that sometimes disturbed my sleep, but a deliberate, powerful motion that sent my hunting gear sliding across the floor. My watch read 12:24 a.m. Outside, Nothing but darkness pressed against the windows of my camp trailer. The rocking intensified. Back and forth, back and forth. 5,000 pounds of metal and supplies moved like it was nothing more than a child's cradle. My name is Samuel Blackwood. October 2009 was supposed to be my time to breathe the clean mountain air of Adams County and fill my freezer with enough venison to last the winter. After 40 years of hunting these woods, I'd earned this extended trip. 36 days of solitude in the wilderness I loved. 7 days in, everything changed. The trailer lurched again, harder this time. My coffee mug toppled from the small folding table and shattered on the linoleum floor. Whatever was out there had enough strength to move my fully loaded 5,500-pound trailer like it weighed nothing. "Bear," I muttered, reaching for the Remington 870 shotgun I kept beside my sleeping bag. My fingers closed around the cold metal barrel, the familiar weight offering little comfort against the violent rocking. I loaded the shotgun with trembling hands, chambering around with a distinctive pump action that echoed in the small trailer. The sound usually deterred curious wildlife, but the rocking continued unabated. I struggled to keep my balance as I moved toward the window, careful not to silhouette myself against the interior light. Peering through a narrow gap in the curtains revealed nothing but blackness. No gleaming eyes, no massive bear silhouette, just the dark outline of pines against a moonless sky. The attack against my trailer continued. Each push came with precision, not the random movements of an animal scratching or investigating. Something was trying to tip me over. I grabbed the air horn I kept for emergencies, stuck my arm out the window, and blasted it 3 times. The harsh sound tore through the night, echoing off the distant ridges. Any normal animal would have bolted at the noise. The rocking continued. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the October chill. I fumbled in my pocket for my truck keys and hit the panic button. Immediately, my Ford F-250 parked beside the trailer erupted with flashing lights and blaring alarms. The rocking stopped. The sudden absence of motion felt almost as jarring as the attack itself. I stood frozen, shotgun clutched in white-knuckled hands, listening to my truck alarm wail into the night. After 30 seconds, I silenced it. What followed was the most unsettling silence I'd ever experienced. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. Even the usual rustle of wind through pine needles had ceased. The forest held its breath. I counted the seconds, then minutes. 5 minutes of absolute stillness passed. Then it came from the ridge behind my trailer, a sound that began as a high-pitched whistle, like air forced through a narrow reed. As I listened, the whistle transformed into something resembling a horse's whinny, but wrong, too guttural, too deliberate. The whinny rose in volume and pitch until it became a bone-chilling howl that made my teeth vibrate. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the howl descended into a deep, rumbling growl that felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. One continuous vocalization, 15 seconds from start to finish, the single most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. Nothing in these mountains made sounds like that. Not bears, not cougars, not wolves. Nothing I'd encountered in 4 decades of hunting. I stood in the middle of my trailer, shotgun pointed at the ceiling, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Sleep was out of the question. I pulled a chair to face the door, sat down with the Remington across my lap, and waited for daylight. Hours crawled by. I didn't move except to stretch my cramping muscles and check my watch. Every shadow outside the windows seemed to shift and move. Every creak of the cooling trailer made me jerk the shotgun toward the sound. Dawn finally broke around 6:30 a.m., pale light filtering through the trees. I waited another 30 minutes for better visibility before unlocking the trailer door. The metal handle felt ice cold against my sweaty palm. The morning air hit my face as I stepped outside, shotgun leading the way. Birds chirped in the distance, normal sounds returning to the forest. I descended the 3 metal steps, my boots crunching on the dirt and pine needles. I'd cleared the area around my trailer when I'd first set up camp, removing sticks and stones for comfort when moving around. The soil was soft from recent rain, perfect for tracking game, perfect for leaving footprints. I circled the trailer slowly, eyes scanning the ground for tracks, for broken branches, for anything to explain what had happened during the night. The truck sat undisturbed where I'd parked it. No scratches marred the trailer's metal sides. The stabilizing jacks at each corner remained in position. But most disturbing of all, no tracks. Not a single footprint or paw print in the soft earth. Something with enough strength to rock a 5,500-pound trailer had approached from somewhere, assaulted my camp, and vanished without leaving a trace. I checked and rechecked, widening my search perimeter. Nothing. I sat heavily on the trailer steps, shotgun still in hand, trying to make sense of what had happened. Could I have dreamed it? No. The broken mug on the floor and my exhausted body confirmed the reality. At 10:18 a.m., the rumble of a truck engine broke through my thoughts. My friend Earl Jenkins pulled his Chevy pickup into the clearing. We'd arranged this visit days ago, planning to hunt together through the weekend before he headed back to town. Earl's familiar bulk emerged from the driver's side, all 6'4" and 240 pounds of him. One look at my face told him something was wrong. "Sam, you look like hell warmed over," he called, slamming his truck door. I nodded, standing to greet him. "Had some trouble last night." Earl listened without interruption as I recounted the events. His expression shifted from concern to disbelief, but he knew me well enough not to question my sanity outright. "That's some story," he said when I finished. "You sure it wasn't just a bear?" "Bears leave tracks, Earl, and they don't make sounds like what I heard." Earl frowned, looking around the campsite. "Well, let's see how hard it would be to rock this rig." He approached the trailer and placed his substantial shoulder against the side. With considerable effort, he pushed. The trailer shifted slightly, moved perhaps an inch before settling back. Earl tried again, this time with a running start. The impact jolted the trailer, making it bounce rather than rock. He stepped back, breathing heavily from the exertion. "No way," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No way in hell could I do what you described. Not smooth rocking. Not with this weight." I nodded, having expected this result. "That's what I figured. What do you want to do? Pack up, head back to town?" The question hung between us. Pride battled with the cold fear still lodged in my stomach. 40 years in these woods, and I'd never retreated before. But I'd also never experienced anything like last night. "Let's stay," I decided finally. "But we're sleeping in shifts, and I want to set up game cameras around the perimeter." Earl nodded, relief and apprehension mixing on his weathered face. "Got 2 in my truck. Motion activated." We spent the afternoon securing the campsite. Earl helped me position the game cameras with overlapping fields of view. We gathered extra firewood, building a larger fire pit than I normally would. Neither of us spoke much about what might return after dark. As sunset approached, Earl grilled steaks on the portable propane stove while I cleaned my shotgun for the 3rd time that day. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, though I still flinched at every snapping twig. "You really think it'll come back?" Earl asked, flipping the steaks. "Don't know, but we'll be ready if it does." We ate in silence as darkness fell. The fire popped and hissed, casting long shadows across the clearing. Earl took first watch, settling into a camp chair with his own rifle across his knees. I crawled into the trailer, exhaustion finally catching up to me. Despite my fatigue, sleep came in fitful bursts. Every time I drifted off, the memory of that inhuman sound pulled me back to wakefulness. At 2 a.m. I gave up, swapping places with Earl. The night passed without incident. When morning arrived, we checked the game cameras. Nothing unusual appeared in the footage. just a raccoon investigating our cooler and an owl swooping past around 3:30 a.m. Days turned into weeks. Earl stayed longer than planned, leaving only when his boss threatened to fire him if he didn't return. The remainder of my hunting trip passed without supernatural incident, though I never again slept soundly in that trailer. I kept the shotgun loaded, the cameras running, and a spotlight within reach at all times. I shot a decent buck on day 29, a 6-pointer that would provide enough meat to justify the trip. The familiar work of field dressing and butchering grounded me somewhat, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the ridgeline. When I finally packed up camp on day 36, relief washed over me. The trailer that had been my home for over a month now felt tainted. As I hitched it to my truck, I glanced one last time at the ridge where that sound had originated. Just trees and rocks. Nothing moved, nothing watched. At least, nothing I could see. The drive home to New Meadows took 3 hours. I kept the radio off, replaying that night in my mind, searching for explanations I hadn't considered. Perhaps a territorial moose? No, the lack of tracks ruled that out. A prankster with exceptional strength? In this remote location, miles from the nearest access road? Unlikely. I pulled into my driveway as afternoon sunlight gilded the mountains to the west. My small house looked exactly as I'd left it over a month ago. The familiar sight should have brought comfort. That night, safe in my own bed, I bolted awake at 12:24 a.m. No rocking motion disturbed me, no otherworldly sounds penetrated the walls, just the normal creaks of an aging house and distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Yet I found myself reaching for the shotgun I'd placed beside the bed. Outside my bedroom window, the forest began less than 50 yards from the house. The same forest that stretched unbroken all the way back to my hunting grounds. I've lived in Adams County my entire life. I know these mountains, these trees, these animals. Or at least, I thought I did. Now I lie awake at night wondering what else might be out there, moving between the pines without leaving tracks, strong enough to toy with a fully loaded trailer, patient enough to wait for the next encounter. I still hunt. I still venture into those same woods, but I never camp alone anymore. And I never, ever stay out after dark. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear it. That whistle that becomes a whinny, that becomes a howl, that becomes a growl. But it's probably just the wind. It has to be just the wind. Because the alternative means accepting that after 40 years of being the hunter, I had briefly become the hunted. And whatever had found me that night might someday find me again. Story 4. I jerked awake to the sound of my own heartbeat. Something had pulled me from sleep. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining to hear over the soft patter of rain on the tense nylon shell. The dense Alaskan forest surrounding my small clearing had fallen unnaturally silent. Then I heard it. A scream tore through the night. High-pitched, agonized, human-like. It came from somewhere in the trees, maybe 200 yards away. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My name is James Harrington. I was a veteran trophy hunter with 15 years of wilderness experience across 3 continents. I'd faced charging boars, territorial moose, and once a mountain lion that nearly took my arm off outside Fairbanks. Nothing had prepared me for this night. I'd come to Whale Pass 3 days ago for the Sitka black-tailed deer season. The hunting had been decent. I'd already tagged a respectable buck with a solid 8-point rack. Tonight was supposed to be my last in the field before heading back to civilization. I'd set up camp in this small clearing because it overlooked a game trail I'd been tracking. The scream came again, longer this time. It started as something like a woman's wail, then descended into a guttural, wet howl that raised every hair on my body. I fumbled for my flashlight, knocking over my water bottle in the process. The plastic clattered against my hunting knife. My hands trembled as I clicked the light on, casting a weak yellow glow across the interior of my tent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and reedy. "Someone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the soft drip of rain. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Dawn was at least 4 hours away. I reached for my Remington 700, the bolt-action rifle I'd used for years. Its familiar weight provided little comfort as I chambered around. The metallic click seemed obscenely loud in the quiet tent. Another scream erupted, closer now. It sounded like a wounded soldier I'd once heard in my army days, a man who'd taken shrapnel to his abdomen and knew he was dying. That raw, primal sound of agony that didn't even sound human anymore. But this was worse. This had a quality to it I couldn't place, something ancient and wrong. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. Rain fell in a light mist, and the beam of my flashlight disappeared into a wall of fog and darkness. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks barely visible beyond the immediate clearing. "I'm armed!" I shouted, trying to project confidence. My voice cracked instead. "State your business." The forest absorbed my words. No echo, no response. I considered my options. My Land Rover was parked nearly 4 miles back at the trailhead. In daylight, it was an easy hike. In this darkness, with the rain and whatever was out there, it might as well have been on the moon. The scream came again. This time, it started low and built to a shrieking crescendo that seemed to last forever. It circled the perimeter of my camp as if the source was moving, not running but methodically pacing. I retreated fully inside my tent, zipping it closed. The thin nylon barrier was purely psychological. Whatever could make sounds like that wouldn't be stopped by tent fabric. I clutched my rifle closer, the cold metal pressing against my chest. 2:43 a.m. The screams continued at irregular intervals, sometimes 5 minutes apart, sometimes 30 seconds, each one different, yet carrying the same underlying tone of absolute agony. I found myself counting the seconds between them, my breath held each time until the next one tore through the night. At 3:12 a.m., something brushed against the outside of my tent. A light touch that traveled from one side to the other. I jerked backward, slamming against my pack. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the tent walls, catching no shadows, no silhouettes. "Who's there?" I demanded, rifle raised toward the direction of the touch. My finger hovered near the trigger, violating every safety rule I'd followed religiously for years. "I will shoot!" Another scream answered me, this one so close it could have been right outside the tent. It no longer sounded like a woman or a wounded man. It had transformed into something worse, like a child being torn apart. The sound fractured, becoming multiple voices overlapping, all screaming in different pitches. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the tent. Water began to seep through the bottom edges, soaking my sleeping bag. I didn't care. I sat rigid, rifle pointed at the tent entrance, flashlight clutched in my other hand. 3:47 a.m. The screaming stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. I strained to hear anything, footsteps, breathing, movement in the underbrush. Nothing came except the rhythmic patter of rain. I allowed myself to believe it had gone, whatever it was. Perhaps a wounded animal that had finally died. Maybe some kind of territorial display from a predator I hadn't encountered before. I'd heard strange things about the vocalizations of wolverines, though nothing in my research mentioned anything like this. A low growl broke the silence, not from outside the tent, but from directly above it. Something heavy moved across the rainfly, causing the entire structure to sag inward. The apex of my tent dipped down, as if being pressed by a substantial weight. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. The coppery taste of blood filled my mouth as I watched the tent ceiling continue to bow downward. My flashlight beam revealed no shape, no form, just the distorted fabric pushing closer to my face. The growl deepened, becoming a rumble that I felt more than heard. It vibrated through the ground and into my bones. Then came a sound like wet leather stretching, followed by heavy breathing directly above me. the hot, moist breath of something large somehow permeating the tent material. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Primal terror locked every muscle in my body. The weight suddenly lifted. The tent sprang back to its normal shape. Before I could process this, the screaming began again, this time from multiple directions simultaneously. It sounded like 3, maybe 4 sources, all circling my small clearing, all producing those same blood-curdling screams. 4:21 a.m. I sat in a puddle of my own sweat and rainwater that had leaked through the tent floor. My arms ached from holding the rifle in a ready position. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness, catching glimpses of movement that might have been rain-soaked branches swaying in the light wind, or might have been something else entirely. The screams continued their irregular pattern. Sometimes they overlapped, sometimes they called and answered each other. Twice more, something brushed against my tent. Once along the side nearest my head, and once at the entrance, pushing inward as if testing the zipper's resistance. I had hunted dangerous game across North America. I had tracked bears that could tear a man in half with one swipe. I had stalked moose during rutting season when they were at their most aggressive. Never had I felt this kind of fear, a deep, soul-crushing certainty that I was being hunted by something that didn't just want to kill me, but wanted me to suffer first. 5:08 a.m. The eastern sky began to lighten imperceptibly. Not true dawn yet, but the first hint that night wouldn't last forever. The screaming abruptly stopped. The silence stretched for 10 minutes, then 15. I remained frozen in position, afraid to believe it was over. At 5:36 a.m., with the grey light of dawn finally filtering through the trees, I heard a distinct sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls moving away from my clearing. The sound tracked northwest, growing fainter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited another 20 minutes before unzipping my tent with trembling hands. The clearing looked exactly as it had when I'd set up camp, the remains of my small fire, my cooking gear neatly stowed on a log, the game trail visible between 2 large spruce trees. The only difference was a series of depressions in the soft ground around my tent. They weren't clear footprints, just shallow indentations in the damp soil that formed a rough circle around my campsite. I approached one, crouching down to examine it more closely. The depression was nearly 2 feet across, with no distinct shape beyond a general roundness. I didn't investigate further. Some deep instinct told me not to follow, not to look for more evidence, not to try to understand what had stalked me through that endless night. I packed my gear in record time, leaving behind a perfectly good cooking pot and half a pack of coffee in my haste. The 4-mile hike back to my Land Rover passed in a blur. Every snapping twig made me whirl around, rifle raised. Every bird call caused my heart to skitter painfully in my chest. I reached the vehicle just after 7 a.m., threw my gear in the back, and drove away from Whale Pass as fast as the rutted logging road would allow. I didn't stop until I reached Ketchikan. I checked into a motel, showered for nearly an hour, and then slept for 14 straight hours with the lights on and a chair propped against the door. I never reported what happened. Who would I tell? The local game warden? The Forest Service? What would I say? That I heard screams in the night? That something circled my tent for hours? That the most terrifying night of my life left no evidence but some vague depressions in soft ground that had probably been washed away by rain within hours? I returned to my home in Montana the next day. I mounted the 8-point Sitka buck on my wall, but I couldn't look at it without hearing those screams echo in my memory. 6 months later, I took it down and gave it away to a hunting buddy. That was 20 years ago. I'm retired now, living in River Oaks, Houston, in a gated community where the nearest wilderness is a carefully manicured golf course. I gave up hunting completely 5 years after that night, sold most of my guns, keeping only a shotgun for home protection. But I still wake up sometimes at 2:17 a.m., my body rigid with terror, the echo of those screams so vivid in my mind that I have to check the windows and doors. I still can't go camping, can't even walk in densely wooded parks without feeling my chest tighten and my palms sweat. When people ask why I gave up hunting, a passion that had defined most of my adult life, I make up stories about aging knees or fading eyesight. I never tell them about Whale Pass, never describe those hours in the darkness with something circling, screaming, waiting. Time hasn't dimmed the memory at all. Most traumatic events fade around the edges, becoming less immediate with passing years. Not this. It remains razor-sharp, vivid, present. When I remember it, I'm instantly transported back to that tent, to that night, to that primal fear that reduced me to something smaller than human. I've researched extensively since then. I've read accounts of strange vocalizations in remote wilderness areas. I've studied cryptozoology and folklore, despite having dismissed such things my entire life before Whale Pass. I've even contacted wildlife biologists specializing in predator behavior in Southeast Alaska. None of it has provided answers. The closest match to what I heard comes from Tlingit legends about a creature they called the Kushtaka, a shape-shifting entity that mimics human screams to lure victims. But I don't believe in monsters or myths. I believe in what I can see, touch, and verify, and yet those screams, that weight on my tent, those depressions in the earth, those were real, tangible things that I experienced. I'm telling this story now, though not under my real name. I've changed enough details that no one who knows me would connect this account to the respected hunting guide and outdoorsman I once was. But the core of it, those hours between 2:17 a.m. and dawn in that small clearing near Whale Pass, that's exactly as it happened. Sometimes I think about going back, about facing whatever it was that terrified me so completely, about proving to myself that it was just a wounded animal or a territorial display or some natural phenomenon I couldn't identify in my panic. But I know I never will, because deep down, in the most honest part of myself, I know that whatever was in those woods that night wasn't something natural, and I'm not sure I could survive hearing those screams again. So I stay in River Oaks, where the only night sounds are air conditioners and distant traffic, and I try not to think about what might still be moving through the forests near Whale Pass, circling campsites, testing tent walls, and waiting for the perfect moment to unleash those blood-curdling screams that sound like a woman being murdered, a soldier being disemboweled, and a child being torn apart, all at once. Story 5. I checked my watch as we unloaded our gear from the truck. 3:30 p.m. Plenty of daylight left. My brother Jason was already stringing his rod, and Ethan was digging through his tackle box. The parking area at Mono Hot Springs Resort was nearly empty. Just how we liked it. Trail should take us about 40 minutes, I said, shouldering my pack. That'll give us a good 3 hours of fishing before dark. Jason nodded. Water level's supposed to be perfect. Rangers said they stocked it last month. The path to Doris Lake wound through thick pine forest, climbing gradually into the El Dorado backcountry. Our boots crunched on the rocky trail as we hiked in single file. I took the lead, with Jason behind me and Ethan bringing up the rear. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across our path. "Damn, Mike, you're setting a pace today," Ethan called from behind, breathing heavily. I slowed a bit. "Sorry, just eager to get there before the fish go down for the evening." The trail steepened as we climbed the canyon wall. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool mountain air. After about 30 minutes, the trees thinned and the trail curved around a rocky outcropping. There it was, Doris Lake, a pristine oval of deep blue water nestled in a natural basin surrounded by pine forest and granite peaks. "Worth the hike," Jason said, coming up beside me. I nodded. "Always is." We made our way down to the shoreline, our boots sliding on loose scree. The lake surface was glass smooth, reflecting the surrounding mountains like a mirror. No other anglers in sight. Perfect. "Let's spread out a bit," I suggested, pointing along the shoreline. I'll take this spot. Jason, maybe try over by those fallen logs. Ethan, that rocky point looks promising. We set up about 30 yards apart from each other. I assembled my rod, tied on a woolly bugger, and began to strip line from my reel. The only sounds were the occasional splash of our casts and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the water. I'd caught and released 2 decent-sized trout and was feeling that perfect mix of contentment and concentration that comes with good fishing. The air temperature dropped noticeably as shadows lengthened across the lake. That's when it happened. The scream tore through the stillness like a physical force. It started as something like a high-pitched wail, then deepened into a guttural, powerful roar that echoed off the canyon walls. I froze mid-cast, the hair on my arms standing straight up. I looked toward Jason. He was standing motionless, rod still in his hand, staring across the lake toward the far shore. Ethan had actually dropped his rod and was scanning the tree line. "What the hell was that?" Jason called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the aftermath of the scream. I shook my head. "Mountain lion, maybe?" But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. I'd heard mountain lions before. This was different. "That was no cougar," Ethan said, picking up his rod with shaking hands. We all stared across the lake at the dense forest on the opposite shore. The scream had come from somewhere in those trees, or perhaps higher up on the mountainside. Nothing moved. No birds called. The entire forest had gone silent. "Probably just some animal," I said, trying to sound casual. "Let's keep fishing." But my hands weren't steady anymore. I found myself constantly glancing up from the water, scanning the tree line. The peaceful feeling was gone, replaced by a prickling awareness of how isolated we were. The hike back to the resort suddenly seemed very long. "If I hear that again, I'm out of here," I called to the others. Jason nodded. "Yeah, me too." We cast half-heartedly for another minute. The light was fading fast now, the golden hour giving way to the blue shadows of dusk. And then it came again. The second scream was louder, more sustained. It started with the same high-pitched wail, but built into something that sounded almost angry. It echoed across the water, bouncing off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact source. It wasn't just louder this time, it was closer. "Go!" I shouted, already reeling in my line with frantic speed. "Now!" No one argued. We didn't bother properly stowing our gear. I collapsed my rod in 3 quick movements, jammed it into my pack, and started moving. Jason was right beside me, and Ethan caught up in seconds. We hit the trail at a run, scrambling up the steep initial section that led away from the lake. "What the fuck was that?" Ethan gasped as we climbed. "Don't know, don't care," Jason replied. "Just move." The light was failing fast now. The forest that had seemed so peaceful on our hike in now loomed dark and threatening. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something watching us. I led the way, setting a punishing pace up the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think it's following us?" Ethan asked after we'd been hiking for about 10 minutes. "Shut up and keep moving," I said. We didn't stop to rest. We didn't slow down at the steepest sections. We just kept pushing forward, driven by an instinctive need to get away from whatever had made that sound. I was breathing like a freight train, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the adrenaline kept me moving. As we neared the top of the canyon wall, I forced myself to stop and listen. Jason and Ethan halted beside me, all of us gasping for breath. The forest was quiet except for the sound of our breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. "Hear anything?" Jason whispered. I shook my head. "Nothing, but let's keep going." We maintained a fast walk for the remainder of the hike, constantly glancing back over our shoulders. The darkness was almost complete now, forcing us to use our flashlights. The beams cut thin corridors through the blackness, making the surrounding forest seem even darker. When the lights of Mono Hot Springs Resort finally appeared through the trees, I felt a rush of relief so powerful my knees nearly buckled. We emerged from the trail into the parking lot, still breathing hard, sweat-soaked, despite the cool evening air. "What the hell do you think that was?" Ethan asked as we threw our gear into the truck. I shook my head. "No idea, but it wasn't normal." "Maybe some drunk hikers messing with us," Jason suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. "There wasn't anyone else out there," I said. "You saw the parking lot when we arrived. Empty." We drove back to town in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were sitting in Ethan's garage with beers in hand that we really talked about it. "I've been hunting these mountains my whole life," Ethan said, staring at his beer bottle. "Never heard anything like that." "It wasn't human," Jason added, "but it wasn't any animal I recognize either." The memory of that scream was still vivid in my mind. The way it had started high before dropping to that powerful, guttural roar. The sheer volume of it. The way it had echoed across the lake. And most disturbing of all, the intelligence it seemed to convey. Not just an animal's call, but something deliberate. "I'm going to look it up," I said. "See if I can find anything similar." Over the next few days, I became obsessed with identifying that sound. I listened to recordings of every predator in the California mountains. Mountain lions, bears, wolves, nothing matched. I expanded my search to include other animals, even exotic species that shouldn't be in our mountains. Still, nothing. Then I stumbled across a website dedicated to Bigfoot research. I'd never given any credence to those stories, just campfire tales and hoaxes as far as I was concerned. But they had an audio section with alleged Bigfoot vocalizations recorded across North America. I clicked play on the first file with a skeptical smirk on my face. The smirk died as the recording played. The hair on my arms stood up again. The sound wasn't identical to what we'd heard at Doris Lake, but the similarities were unmistakable. That same transition from high to low, the same sustained quality, the same impossible volume. I called Jason immediately. "You need to hear this," I said without preamble when he answered. "Hear what?" "Just come over. Bring Ethan if you can." An hour later, they were both sitting in my living room. I played them the recordings without explanation, watching their faces carefully. Ethan went pale. Jason's eyes widened. "That's it," Jason said quietly when the recording ended. "That's what we heard." "Not exactly the same," Ethan noted, "but damn close." "You know what they're claiming this is, right?" I asked, pointing at the computer screen. Jason leaned forward to read the website header. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Bigfoot? Come on, Mike." "I'm not saying that's what it is," I said defensively. "I'm just saying that whatever we heard matches these recordings better than any known animal." We debated it for hours that night. Jason remained skeptical, suggesting it could be some kind of hoax or maybe a rare atmospheric phenomenon that distorted the sound of a conventional animal. Ethan was less certain, pointing out the complete absence of other people at the lake. I kept my own thoughts, mostly to myself, but the experience had shaken my certainty about what does and doesn't exist in our mountains. A week later, I was having coffee with my sister Lisa when she mentioned her friend Carrie, who worked at Mono Hot Springs Resort. "She's been acting weird lately," Lisa said. "Ever since that day she was out riding her horse in the backcountry." "Weird how?" I asked, suddenly alert. Lisa shrugged. "Jumpy. Doesn't want to go out on the trails alone anymore. Says she saw something." "What did she see?" "She wouldn't tell me at first. Thought I'd think she was crazy. But finally, she said she saw a Bigfoot walking through a meadow near Doris Lake." "Can you believe that?" My coffee cup froze halfway to my mouth. "When was this?" "Couple weeks ago, I think." "Why?" I told her about our experience at the lake, about the screams, about our mad dash back to the resort. Her expression changed from amusement to concern as I spoke. "You think she really saw something?" Lisa asked when I finished. "I don't know, but I know what I heard, and it wasn't anything normal." I got Carrie's number from Lisa and called her that evening. At first, she was reluctant to talk, clearly embarrassed about her story. But when I told her about our experience, words began pouring out of her. "I was riding up near Survey Ridge," she said. "There's a series of meadows up there, about 2 miles from Doris Lake. I stopped to let my horse rest, and that's when I saw it." "What exactly did you see?" I asked. "It walked out of the trees on the far side of the meadow. At first I thought it was a hiker in a dark coat, but the way it moved was different, more fluid, and it was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller." "Did it see you?" "I think so. It stopped at the edge of the meadow and looked right at me. My horse went crazy, trying to back up, snorting. I was fighting to control her. When I looked back up, it was gone." "Did you hear anything?" "No, not then. But about a week later, I was closing up the resort office and I heard this scream from the direction of the lake, like nothing I've ever heard before." After talking to Carrie, I did more research. Turned out there had been scattered reports of strange sightings and sounds in the El Dorado backcountry going back decades. Nothing conclusive, nothing that ever made the mainstream news, but enough to establish a pattern. I showed my findings to Jason and Ethan. Jason remained skeptical, but couldn't explain what we'd heard. Ethan became increasingly convinced that we'd encountered something unknown to science. As for me, I don't know what to believe. I'm not ready to say we heard a Bigfoot that night at Doris Lake, but I know what I heard wasn't human, and it wasn't any recognized animal. Something was out there in those mountains, something powerful enough to make 3 grown men run in primal fear. It's been 6 months now. The fishing season is open again, and the trout are biting all across El Dorado County, but none of us has gone back to Doris Lake. I don't think we ever will. Some places, once marked by terror, can never feel safe again. Sometimes at night, I still hear that scream in my dreams, that high wail dropping to a roaring bellow, echoing across dark water. I wake up sweating, listening to the normal sounds of my house, grateful for solid walls and locked doors between me and whatever lurks in the remote corners of our mountains. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what we encountered that evening, but I know this. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation. Things that remind us that despite all our technology and civilization, there are still mysteries in the wild places, and sometimes those mysteries have teeth. Story 6. I felt the weight shift from my right knee to my left as I adjusted my position behind the fallen oak. Perfect cover, perfect vantage point. I'd been hunting this stretch of Hillcrest Creek for 15 seasons, and I knew the land better than the back of my hand. The natural bottleneck where 3 wooded hills converged was a gold mine for whitetails, especially in early November when the rut had them moving carelessly. My compound bow rested across my thigh, the carbon fiber arrows in my quiver catching dull glints of the afternoon sun that filtered through the canopy. I'd sprayed myself down with scent killer that morning, chewed pine needles to mask my breath, and wore my best camouflage. I was invisible. The forest breathed around me, a slight breeze moving through the trees, the occasional snap of a small branch, birds calling to each other. I recognized every sound, categorized each rustle instantaneously. Squirrel, raccoon, nothing worth my attention. Then I heard it, the soft splash of hooves crossing the shallow creek bed maybe 40 yards downstream. My muscles tensed. I slowly raised my bow, nocking an arrow with practiced fingers that moved without conscious thought. The string pulled back to my cheek, the tension in the compound building, then holding at exactly 65 pounds. My breathing slowed. 10 more seconds, and I'd have venison for the freezer. That's when the crows exploded overhead. At least 20 black shapes burst from the trees above me, wings beating frantically, their harsh calls shattering the perfect quiet. I froze, keeping the bow drawn, but shifting my eyes upward. Crows didn't spook like that for no reason. Maybe a hawk had disturbed them, or an owl. The crows circled overhead, their agitation growing more intense with each pass. Something was seriously wrong. The deer I'd been tracking suddenly bolted, but the sound that reached my ears wasn't the familiar quick staccato of deer hooves on forest floor. It sounded like a bulldozer plowing through the underbrush. Branches snapped like shotgun blasts. Entire saplings cracked. The ground vibrated beneath my knees. "What the hell?" I whispered, my bow still drawn, but my confidence evaporating. The noise moved away from me, back down the bottleneck. Whatever it was crashed through the woods with incredible force, heedless of the racket it made. The crows followed it, still circling and cawing, marking its progress like a feathered alarm system. I slowly released the tension on my bow, my arrow still nocked, but no longer at full draw. My heart hammered against my ribs. In 15 years hunting these woods, I'd never heard anything like that. Black bear occasionally wandered through, but even the biggest bears moved with more grace than whatever had just torn through the underbrush. The crashing stopped at the bottom of the bottleneck, where the three hills converged. The crows continued to circle, their cawing slightly diminished but still agitated. I counted 60 seconds of tense silence, my ears straining to capture any clue of what lay ahead. Then it happened. A scream tore through the forest, a sound so primal and powerful it seemed to physically strike me. It started low, a deep bass rumble that quickly climbed into a shrieking roar that echoed off all three hillsides. The sound bounced back and forth between the slopes, multiplying, surrounding me with its horrible intensity. I dropped my bow. My hands shot to my ears too late to block the sound that had already penetrated my skull and rattled my teeth. This wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't a bear. It was nothing that belonged in these woods. Nothing I'd ever encountered in my life. Before the echoes faded, it screamed again, closer this time, louder. Only 30 yards away, the force of it hit me like a physical wave. My clothing rippled against my skin. The air vibrated, trees shuddered. The sound contained rage and hunger and power that defied explanation. I crouched lower, an instinctive, useless attempt to hide from something that could make a sound like that. Then the impossible happened. From the southwest hill, another scream answered, different in pitch, but identical in its otherworldly quality. Another predator, another monster. My breath caught in my throat as a third call erupted from the southeast. 3 of them, 3 creatures, forming a rough triangle with me at the center. They were coordinating, hunting me. The realization hit me with such clarity that time seemed to stop. I'd walked into their trap thinking myself the predator when I'd been prey all along. The deer I'd been tracking had probably been fleeing from them. The scene from Jurassic Park flashed through my mind. The raptors circling, communicating, herding their prey exactly where they wanted it. Except this was Hillcrest Creek, not some tropical island or Hollywood set. This was my hunting ground, my home territory. I had seconds to decide. My bow lay on the ground where I'd dropped it. My truck was parked a mile north, up a steep trail. The bottleneck, the only easy path out, was blocked by whatever had made that first scream. The creatures called to each other again, all 3 vocalizing in sequence. They were closer now, moving in. I abandoned my bow, left my pack. I ran. I crashed through underbrush I would normally navigate with silent precision. Thorns tore at my clothes. Branches whipped my face. I scrambled up the western hillside, away from the bottleneck, away from the obvious path. My lungs burned. My legs pumped with adrenaline-fueled strength. Behind me, I heard them moving, fast, much faster than me, breaking through the forest with that same freight train force I'd heard earlier. I didn't look back, couldn't afford to. Every second counted. The hill grew steeper. My boots slipped on dead leaves and loose rocks. I grabbed tree trunks, saplings, anything to pull myself upward. My fingers bled. My breath came in ragged gasps. Something hot ran down my leg. I realized with distant embarrassment that I'd pissed myself. The fear had bypassed every conscious control system in my body. I was operating on pure animal instinct now. I reached the crest of the hill and risked a glance back. The forest below appeared empty, but I could hear them, crashing through the woods, circling to cut me off. They knew these hills too. I changed direction, heading northeast toward an old logging road that would eventually lead back to the county highway. If I could reach it, maybe I could flag down a passing car. The sun was getting lower. I had 2 hours of daylight left at most. The thought of being in these woods after dark with those things hunting me sent another jolt of adrenaline through my system. I half ran, half tumbled down the opposite side of the hill, using trees to break my momentum. The logging road should be about a quarter-mile ahead. I could make it, had to make it. A scream erupted from my right, so close I could almost feel hot breath behind it. I veered left, abandoning my path to the logging road, simply running away from the sound. Branches scratched my face. I lost my hat. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The ground leveled off into a marshy area I didn't recognize. Water soaked my boots. Mud sucked at my feet. I was off my mental map of the area, in terrain I hadn't hunted before. I stopped, bending over with my hands on my knees, desperately trying to catch my breath and orient myself. The forest had gone quiet. No crashing sounds, no screams, just my own rasping breaths and hammering heart. Had I lost them? Had they given up? I forced myself to think. The sun was to my left, setting in the west. That meant I was facing south. The creek should be somewhere to my right. If I followed it downstream, I'd eventually hit Wilson Bridge Road. I took 3 steps in that direction when a low, rumbling growl stopped me cold. It came from the thick brush directly ahead, exactly where I'd been about to go. The sound was different from the screams, but no less terrifying. It was deliberate, a warning, or a signal. Another growl answered from behind me, and a third from my left. They'd herded me exactly where they wanted me. The marshy area was a trap. My legs trembled beneath me. My nerve endings fired random signals of panic throughout my body. I'd never felt fear like this. Not when I'd fallen from my tree stand and broken my arm. Not when I'd come face to face with an angry black bear. Not even when the doctors told me they'd found a mass in my wife Carol's breast 2 years ago. This was primal terror. The DNA deep fear of being hunted. I backed up slowly, my boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud. The brush ahead of me rustled. Something large was moving there, just out of sight. The growth obscured its shape, but I caught glimpses of movement. Something tall, at least 7 feet, shifting its weight from side to side. I couldn't run. They'd catch me in seconds. I couldn't fight. I had nothing but a hunting knife on my belt. My back pressed against the rough bark of a massive oak tree. I fumbled for my knife, pulling it from its sheath. The 6-inch blade looked pathetically small in my shaking hand. The growling intensified. The brush parted slightly. I caught a glimpse of what waited for me, a flash of reddish-brown hair, not fur. A massive limb that ended in something like a hand, but wrong. Fingers too long, joints that bent at unnatural angles. My world narrowed to that single glimpse of nightmare anatomy. My mind refused to process it, to put it together into a coherent whole. Then, from far to the east, a new sound cut through the forest. Engines, ATVs, human voices calling back and forth, the weekend riders. A group of local guys who tore through the forest on their 4-wheelers every Saturday afternoon. I'd always hated them for ruining the hunting with their noise. Now, they were my only hope. The creature in the brush pulled back. The growling stopped. The forest held its breath. I took a chance. I screamed, "Help! Over here! Help me!" My voice bounced between the trees, carrying in the still air. The ATVs paused momentarily, then revved louder. They'd heard me. I screamed again, waving my arms even though they couldn't see me through the dense forest. "I'm here! Help!" The creatures retreated. I could hear them moving back, fading into the forest in 3 different directions. The ATV engines grew louder, approaching fast. My legs finally gave out. I slid down the trunk of the oak tree and sat hard in the mud, knife still clutched in my hand. I was sobbing, I realized, great heaving breaths that hurt my chest. 3 ATVs burst into the clearing, spraying mud and water. Local boys in their 20s wearing hunter orange vests and bandanas, looks of concern on their faces as they killed their engines. "Mister, you okay?" The leader, a kid with a red beard I vaguely recognized from town, approached cautiously. "You hurt?" I tried to form words, to explain what had happened, but nothing coherent came out, just broken phrases. Something in the woods, screaming. They were hunting me. The young men exchanged glances. One pointed to my soaked pants. "Jesus, he pissed himself. Think he's having a stroke or something?" "Dunno. Better get him back to town." They helped me onto the back of an ATV. I still couldn't form a sentence that made sense. My body shook with violent tremors that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. As we started moving, I looked back at the marsh. The forest beyond was still, peaceful in the fading light. Whatever had been there was gone, or hiding, waiting for the humans to leave. The ride back to town passed in a blur. The young men dropped me at the small medical clinic where Dr. Hayes checked me over, found nothing physically wrong, and diagnosed acute stress reaction. I nodded, accepted the sedative he offered, and called Carol to pick me up. I never told her what really happened, never told anyone the full story until now. I said I got disoriented in the woods, panicked, and embarrassed myself in front of some local kids. I sold my bow the next week, sold my guns too. Carol was surprised but pleased. She'd never liked hunting. I told her I'd lost interest, wanted to take up golf instead. The truth is, I can't go back in those woods, can't go into any woods, not after realizing the truth that day. We're not the apex predator. We never were. Whatever lives in the forests around Hillcrest Creek, whatever hunted me that day, it's still out there, watching, waiting, smarter and stronger than anything that should exist in this world. Sometimes at night, when the windows are open and the wind blows from the direction of the creek, I think I hear them calling to each other in the distance, not the full-throated screams that shook my clothing, but softer vocalizations, communications I can't decipher. They know where I live. They could come for me any time, but they don't. Maybe they respect the boundaries we've established. Maybe they're just waiting for me to venture back into their territory. I never will. The woods belong to them now. Maybe they always did. Story 7. I woke up at 1:17 a.m. I remember because the red numbers on my alarm clock burned through the darkness of my bedroom. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound I couldn't place at first. My eyes adjusted to the dim light as I lay still in my bed listening. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from my window. My name is Alex Morgan. I was 12 years old in the summer of 1975, living with my parents and younger sister in Fort Frances, Ontario. Our house sat at the edge of town, where civilization gave way to dense pine forest. My bedroom was on the second floor, and my window faced the backyard and the tree line beyond. The breathing continued, loud enough to hear clearly across my bedroom. I froze under my blankets, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, about 8 feet from my bed. The curtains were open. I always left them that way so morning sunlight would wake me up. Now I regretted that habit. Moonlight spilled through the glass, casting a pale blue glow across my floor. And there, framed in my window, was a silhouette. My first thought was bear. We got black bears in Fort Francis sometimes, especially in summer when they came looking for food. But bears didn't stand 7 feet off the ground. My window was on the second floor with nothing underneath to step on, no ledge, no porch roof, nothing, just the straight drop to the yard below. I squinted through the darkness. The silhouette didn't move, but the breathing continued, heavy, in and out, in and out. As my eyes adjusted better, I could make out more details. The shape had shoulders, distinct, broad shoulders. Not a bear, not any animal I recognized. The creature's head nearly reached the top of my window frame. Its outline was dark against the night sky behind it. I couldn't make out any facial features, just the massive shape of its head and those shoulders. The rest of its body remained hidden below the windowsill, but I knew it had to be standing on something. Or it was tall, impossibly tall. I shifted slightly in my bed, and the thing moved too. Just a small adjustment, a tilt of that massive head, but I knew immediately it was watching me. It knew I was awake. My throat closed up. I couldn't scream, couldn't call for my parents down the hall. My entire body trembled under the sheets as I stared at the thing, and it stared back at me. The breathing got louder, deeper, like it was pressing closer to the glass. I yanked my blanket up over my head, but left a small opening so I could still see the window. I don't know why I did that, why I didn't just hide completely, but some part of me needed to watch to know what it would do next. For 5 minutes, we stayed like that, me under my blanket peeking out. The thing at my window, breathing and watching. I counted the seconds in my head, trying to control my own breathing so I wouldn't pass out. Then slowly, the silhouette turned. It didn't disappear from view like it was climbing down. It turned and moved away horizontally, like it was walking away on level ground, 7 feet off the ground. The moment it was gone, I bolted. I threw my blanket aside and ran full speed down the hallway to my parents' room. I crashed through their door, sobbing and babbling about something at my window. "Whoa, whoa, Alex!" My dad sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Slow down. What's happening?" "There's something outside my window," I gasped between sobs. "It was watching me." Dad grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside the bed and followed me into the hallway. Mom was right behind him. "Stay here with your mother," Dad said, his voice stern but calm. "No!" I clutched his arm. "Don't go out there." "Alex, honey," Mom pulled me into her arms. "Your father will check. It was probably just a dream." "It wasn't a dream." My voice cracked. "It was breathing. I heard it." Dad went downstairs, and I heard the back door open. Mom took me to the kitchen, where we sat at the table. She made me a glass of water, but my hands shook too much to hold it properly. 10 minutes later, Dad came back inside. His face was grim. "Well, I didn't see anything out there now," he said, placing his bat against the wall. "But I smelled something. Smelled like a bear's been around." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It had shoulders, and it was standing at my window." Dad and Mom exchanged glances. "Your window's pretty high up, buddy," Dad said gently. "Nothing could reach that without a ladder." "It did. I saw it." They didn't believe me. Dad checked every door and window in the house, making sure everything was locked. Mom made up the couch in the living room and said I could sleep there for the night. No way was I going back to my room. I didn't sleep at all. I kept staring at the living room windows, expecting to see that silhouette again, hear that breathing, but nothing came. When morning arrived, Dad went outside to check around the house in daylight. I followed him despite Mom's protests. The grass beneath my window showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints, no ladder marks, nothing. "See, Alex," Dad gestured to the unmarked ground. "Nothing could have—" He stopped mid-sentence, looking toward the rabbit hutch at the edge of our yard. Dad had built it for my sister Jenny's 2 rabbits, Floppy and Cotton, last spring. The door of the hutch stood open. Dad jogged over to it and I followed. The rabbits were gone. "That's strange," Dad mumbled, examining the cage. "No damage to the latch. It's like someone just opened it." A cold feeling spread through my chest. The thing at my window took them. Dad shook his head. Now, Alex, don't jump to conclusions. Could have been a fox or raccoon that figured out the latch. But I knew better. Whatever had stood at my window had taken Jenny's rabbits, and it had watched me first. Jenny cried all morning about her missing pets. Mom promised to get her new rabbits next weekend, but that didn't stop the tears. I couldn't tell her what I suspected had happened to Floppy and Cotton. I couldn't tell anyone what I really thought. The next night I refused to sleep in my room. I camped out on the living room couch again, telling my parents I just needed a couple more nights to feel safe. Dad looked worried, but agreed. Maybe we should call Sheriff Tanner, I suggested at dinner. Have him look around. And tell him what? Dad asked. That something might have stolen the rabbits. He'd just say it was wildlife. But what about what I saw at the window? Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Honey, you were half asleep. Our minds play tricks on us when we're like that. I wasn't half asleep. I was wide awake. Dad sighed. Tell you what, I'll set up some floodlights in the backyard. If anything comes around again, the lights will scare it off. The next day, Dad installed motion-activated lights that would illuminate the entire backyard if triggered. He also placed a trail camera near where the rabbit hutch had been. The camera was something he used for hunting, to track deer movements. This'll catch anything that comes into our yard, he assured me. That night, I agreed to try sleeping in my room again. Dad put a chair under my doorknob. Just to make you feel safer, he said. I pushed my dresser in front of the window before getting into bed. I didn't sleep. I lay there watching the window, listening for breathing. Around midnight, the floodlights in the backyard suddenly blazed on. I jumped out of bed and ran to push aside the dresser just enough to see out. The yard was empty in the bright light. The tree line at the back of our property remained dark and impenetrable. After about a minute, the lights shut off automatically. Nothing had triggered them except maybe a raccoon or stray cat. Something too small to be picked up from my viewpoint. This pattern continued for 3 more nights. The lights would come on, I'd check, see nothing, and they'd go off again. Dad checked the trail camera every morning, but only caught images of neighborhood cats and once, a fox. On the 5th night after my encounter, something changed. I had finally started to relax enough to fall asleep before midnight. But at 1:17 a.m., exactly the same time as before, I woke up suddenly. The floodlights weren't on. The house was completely silent. Then I heard it, the breathing. This time, it wasn't coming from my window. It was coming from my closet. My entire body went rigid with terror. The breathing was unmistakable, that same heavy, rhythmic sound I'd heard at the window. But how could it be in my room? The chair was still wedged under my doorknob. The window was still blocked by my dresser. I turned my head slowly toward the closet. The door was open, just a crack. I always kept it firmly shut at night. Always. The breathing continued, deep and steady. I couldn't see anything in the darkness of the closet, just that small opening where the door stood ajar. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but lie there listening to that breathing. But my body wouldn't respond. Fear had paralyzed me completely. A low thump came from inside the closet. Then another, like footsteps. Something was moving in there, coming closer to the door. I saw fingers, long, dark fingers, curl around the edge of the closet door. The door began to open wider, inch by inch. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, I threw off my blankets and lunged for the bedroom door. I knocked the chair aside, yanked the door open, and ran down the hallway screaming for my parents. They both came running from their bedroom. Dad had his bat again. "It's in my closet!" I screamed, pointing back toward my room. "The thing from the window! It's in there!" Dad pushed past me, bat raised. Mom held me tight as we watched from the hallway. I could hear Dad moving around my room, opening the closet door wider, checking inside. "There's nothing here, Alex," he called out. "The closet's empty." Check under the bed! Check everywhere! Dad did a thorough search of my entire room. No sign of any intruder. No sign the closet had been disturbed. The window was still blocked by my dresser. The house was still locked up tight. "But I heard it," I insisted, trembling in Mom's arms. "I heard the breathing. I saw fingers on the door." Mom and Dad exchanged that look again. The one that said they thought I was either making things up or having some kind of breakdown. That night I slept in their room on a sleeping bag on the floor. The next day Mom called Dr. Wilkins, our family doctor, and made an appointment for me. Dr. Wilkins examined me, asked me a bunch of questions about school, friends, if I was feeling stressed about anything. He told my parents I might be experiencing night terrors, vivid, frightening episodes that could seem completely real. "But I wasn't asleep when it happened," I protested. "Both times, I was wide awake." Dr. Wilkins smiled kindly. "Sometimes, with these episodes, we think we're awake when we're actually still partially asleep. Your brain can be very convincing, Alex." He prescribed a mild sedative to help me sleep and suggested I keep a regular bedtime routine. Mom and Dad seemed relieved to have a medical explanation. I took the pills because they made me, but I knew what I had seen and heard wasn't a dream or night terror. 2 weeks passed. With the sedatives, I slept through the night without waking. No breathing, no figures at my window or in my closet. Dad took down the trail camera, saying we didn't need it anymore. The floodlights stayed, which gave me some comfort. Then one night, I forgot to take my pill. I was feeling better, more confident, and thought maybe one night without it would be okay. At 1:17 a.m., I woke up. The floodlights outside were on, bathing the yard in harsh white light. I got up and went to the window, moving aside the dresser I still kept there. The yard was empty at first glance. Then I noticed movement at the tree line. A dark figure stood just at the edge of the light's reach. Tall, broad-shouldered, watching the house, watching my window. I gasped and stumbled backward. The figure stepped forward just slightly into the light. What I saw in that moment has stayed with me for 47 years. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't human. It stood on 2 legs, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a broad chest and those distinct shoulders I'd seen silhouetted in my window. Its body was covered in dark fur or hair, but its hands, those long-fingered hands I'd seen on my closet door, were almost human-like, only larger, with longer fingers ending in points. Its face is what haunts me most. In the harsh floodlight, I could see its features clearly. A flat, wide nose, a mouth too large for its face, slightly open, showing teeth, and its eyes, 2 reflected points of light staring directly at my window, directly at me. It knew I was watching. It lifted one of those long-fingered hands and placed it flat against its chest. Then it pointed at me. I screamed and ran from my room. The entire house woke up in chaos. Dad with his bat, Mom trying to calm me, my sister crying from the noise. By the time Dad got outside with a flashlight, the thing was gone. The next day, Sheriff Tanner finally came out to our house. Dad had called him after finding something disturbing, large, unusual footprints at the edge of our property where the thing had stood. The prints were over 15 inches long and 8 inches wide, with distinct toe marks. They didn't match any animal Sheriff Tanner had ever seen. "Could be a prank," he suggested, casting a suspicious glance my way. "Someone in a costume trying to scare the boy." "Who would do that?" Mom asked. "And how would they get up to a second-story window?" Sheriff Tanner had no answer for that. That summer, more people in Fort Francis reported missing pets. 2 more houses reported strange noises or figures outside their windows at night. Everyone blamed bears or wolves or teenagers pulling pranks. But I knew what it was. I knew it was the same thing that had stood at my window, hidden in my closet, and pointed at me from our yard. Whatever it was, it had marked me somehow, chosen me. My parents put the house up for sale that fall. By Christmas, We had moved to Thunder Bay, far from Fort Francis and its forests. I never saw the creature again, but I've never forgotten it either. I'm 59 years old now. I still wake up sometimes at exactly 1:17 a.m., listening for that heavy breathing outside my window. I still check my closet before bed every night. I still can't explain what I saw or why it came to my window that summer night in 1975, but I know it was real. It wasn't a dream, a night terror, or my imagination. Something stood at my window that night, something that shouldn't exist, something that wanted me to know it was there. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night through areas where civilization gives way to wilderness, I find myself checking my rearview mirror, watching the tree line, wondering if it's still out there, watching, breathing, waiting. Story 8. The radio crackled with static as we drove down Pelham Road, just outside St. Catherine's. It was late October 1978, and the nights had started getting darker earlier. Churchill fiddled with the dial, trying to find something other than the same 5 songs they'd been playing all week. "Give it up, Church. Radio's garbage out here," I said, keeping my eyes on the winding road ahead. "My name's Marcus Lee. Most folks just call me Lee. 23 years old then, working at the paper mill and spending weekends either at the bars or fishing with Churchill down at 12 Mile Creek. Nothing special about me, except maybe I had a bit of a temper and didn't back down easy. That's what my old man always said anyway." The headlights of my '72 Chevy cut through the darkness, illuminating just enough of the road to navigate by. Trees crowded both sides, their branches reaching over like bony fingers. The road was empty at this hour, just after 11 p.m., which is why I was doing about 10 over the limit. "You think Donna's still going to be at Rusty's when we get there?" Churchill asked, finally giving up on the radio. He'd been trying to work up the courage to talk to the bartender for weeks. "If you'd stop taking forever to get ready, we wouldn't be running late," I replied, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. The road curved ahead, and I slowed slightly. That's when I first saw it. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, squinting through the windshield. About 50 yards ahead, illuminated in my headlights, stood what looked like a man in the middle of the road, just standing there, not moving. "Some drunk idiot," Churchill said, leaning forward. "He's going to get himself killed." I eased off the gas and tapped the horn. The figure didn't budge. I hit the horn again, longer this time, the sound blaring through the quiet night. Still nothing. "Jesus Christ," I swore, slowing further but still approaching. The figure remained planted firmly in the center of the lane, facing us directly. At about 30 yards, I could make out more details. Tall, easily over 6 feet. But something was off. The proportions weren't right. The head seemed too angular, the shoulders too broad for the frame. "Move, you stupid bastard," I shouted, though the windows were up. I laid on the horn continuously now, the sound filling the car. 20 yards, 15. The figure hadn't moved an inch. "Lee, you gotta stop," Churchill yelled, bracing himself against the dashboard. I cursed and yanked the wheel hard to the left, tires screeching against the asphalt. The Chevy fish-tailed, and for a second I thought we might roll. We missed the figure by inches, skidding to a stop about 20 feet past it. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "Did you see that?" Churchill's voice trembled. "He didn't even flinch." "That son of a bitch nearly got us killed," I spat, rage replacing fear. I threw the car into park and flung open the door. "Lee, what are you doing? Let's just go." Churchill grabbed at my sleeve, but I shook him off. "Nobody pulls that shit with me," I growled, stepping out into the cool night air. The figure still stood in the middle of the road, now facing my direction. My headlights cast long shadows, but illuminated enough for me to see it hadn't moved from its spot. I started walking toward it, my boots heavy on the asphalt. "Hey!" I shouted. "What the hell's your problem?" No response, no movement. I stopped about 10 feet away, suddenly uncertain. Something was very wrong. The figure stood unnaturally still, and now that I was closer, I could see it wasn't wearing clothes like I'd first thought. Its skin looked wrong, textured, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Lee, get back in the car," Churchill called from the passenger window, his voice tight with fear. I hesitated, then took another step forward. That's when the headlights caught it full on, and everything I thought I knew about the world shattered. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything human at all. The thing stood about 7 feet tall, its body covered in what looked like dark, greenish-grey scales. Its head was elongated, with a snout-like protrusion where a nose should be. Yellow eyes with vertical slits reflected my headlights like a cat's, but there was nothing feline about this creature. Its limbs were long and muscular, ending in hands with long, curved claws. "What the fuck?" I whispered, my mouth suddenly bone dry. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those inhuman eyes. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth. I backed up a step, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of costume, some sick joke. But deep down I knew better. No costume could move like that, with such fluid, predatory grace. "Lee!" Churchill screamed from the car. "Get back here!" The creature's attention shifted to the sound of Churchill's voice, and I used that moment to turn and sprint back to the car. I yanked open the door, but before jumping in, a surge of defiance hit me. I wasn't going to run like some scared kid. "Stay here," I told Churchill, and reached behind the seat to grab the Louisville Slugger I kept there for protection. "Are you insane?" Churchill hissed, but I was already heading back, bat gripped tightly in my hands. The creature watched me approach, its head moving in small, jerky motions like a reptile. It made no sound, showed no emotion, just observed me with those cold, yellow eyes. "I don't know what the hell you are," I said, voice shaking despite my efforts to sound tough, "but you need to get off this road." I raised the bat to an attacking position. The creature's eyes followed the movement but showed no fear, no recognition of the threat. With a yell that was half fear and half rage, I swung the bat as hard as I could at its midsection. The wood connected with a solid thud that should have doubled over any man. The creature didn't even flinch. It was like hitting a tree trunk. Before I could process what happened, the thing moved with lightning speed. One clawed hand shot out and grabbed the bat, yanking it from my grip with such force that splinters dug into my palms. With minimal effort, it snapped the solid ash bat in two, the crack echoing through the night like a gunshot. I stumbled backward, true fear washing over me for the first time. The creature dropped the broken pieces of my bat and took a step toward me. Its mouth opened wider, revealing more of those razor-sharp teeth. I turned and ran. No pride, no tough guy act, just pure survival instinct. I practically dove into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. "Go, go, go!" Churchill screamed, his face drained of all color. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The tires spun for a second before catching, and we lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature still standing in the road, watching us leave. "What the fuck was that thing?" Churchill's voice cracked, his eyes wild with panic. I don't know. My sentence cut off as something heavy landed on the hood of the car. The creature had leaped, actually leaped, the 20 feet between us and landed on my hood, its clawed hands leaving deep gouges in the metal. Its face pressed against the windshield, those yellow eyes staring directly at me. The glass fogged slightly from its breath. Churchill screamed. I swerved wildly, trying to shake it off. The creature clung to the hood for several seconds before suddenly pushing off with its powerful legs. It soared through the air and disappeared into the dense trees alongside the road. I didn't slow down. I pushed that Chevy faster than it had ever gone, the speedometer needle quivering past 90 as we tore down that dark country road. We didn't talk for the first 10 minutes, just drove. The only sound our ragged breathing and the engine straining under the speed. Finally, when we hit the outskirts of St. Catherine's proper, with streetlights and houses replacing the dense woods, I slowed to a more reasonable speed. "Did that really happen?" Churchill finally asked, his voice barely audible. I glanced down at my hands. They were cut from the splinters when the creature had ripped the bat away. Real blood. Real pain. "Yeah," I said hoarsely. "It happened." "What was it, Lee? Some kind of... I don't know." I couldn't bring myself to say the words that were forming in my mind. Monster. Alien. Not of this world. "It looked like a goddamn alligator," I finally said, "but standing up, like a man." Churchill nodded slowly. "But different. Not like those Bigfoot stories. This wasn't some hairy ape thing. This was reptile." We pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner instead of continuing to Rusty's. Neither of us was in the mood for drinking anymore. We needed light, people, normalcy. The waitress gave us funny looks when we ordered coffee with shaking hands, but she didn't ask questions. Maybe she thought we were drunk or high. I almost wished we were. "We need to tell someone," Churchill said after his second cup. "Like who? The cops?" "Excuse me, officer, we just saw a lizard man on Pelham Road. They'd breathalyze us and throw us in the drunk tank." "But what if it hurts someone? What if some family breaks down out there tonight?" I hadn't thought of that. The idea of that thing approaching a car with kids inside made my stomach twist. "Fine. We'll stop by the station on the way home, but they won't believe us." Churchill was right. The desk sergeant listened to our story with increasing skepticism, eventually asking us to take a breathalyzer test, which we both passed. Still, he wrote down our statement with obvious disbelief, probably filing it mentally under drunk kids seeing things. "We'll send a patrol car out that way," he said finally, clearly just wanting us gone. "You boys go home and get some sleep." We knew nothing would come of it. I dropped Churchill off at his place around 1 a.m. Neither of us wanted to be alone, but neither could we bring ourselves to talk about what we'd seen anymore. "Lee," Churchill said as he got out, "do you think we should go back, in daylight, I mean? Look for, I don't know, tracks or something?" The thought made my skin crawl. "No, whatever that thing was, I don't want to find it again." He nodded, relief evident on his face. "Yeah, you're right." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow, slitted pupils staring at me through the windshield. I kept checking the locks on my doors and windows. The next morning I examined my car. The claw marks on the hood were deep and distinct. 4 parallel grooves in the metal. No human could have made those. I took pictures with my Polaroid camera, needing some kind of evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. Churchill called around noon. "Did you see the paper?" he asked without greeting. "No. Why?" "Someone else reported seeing something weird last night. Out near Short Hills Provincial Park. They're calling it a large, unidentified animal." My blood ran cold. That's only a few miles from where we were. "Lee, what if there are more of them?" I had no answer. Over the next few weeks, a few more sightings were reported in the local paper. A trucker claimed he nearly hit a giant iguana crossing Highway 406. A couple said they saw a tall, scaly figure watching them from the tree line while they were camping. Each report was treated as a hoax or a case of mistaken identity. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe, or escaped exotic pets. Churchill and I knew better. We recognized the descriptions. Same height, same reptilian features, same unnatural way of moving. I avoided driving at night after that, especially on rural roads. I sold my Chevy and bought a sturdier truck, telling myself it was for practical reasons, not because I couldn't stand to see those claw marks every day. Churchill moved to Toronto 6 months later, said he needed a change, but I knew he couldn't stand being so close to those woods anymore. We kept in touch for a while, but eventually drifted apart. Some experiences are too heavy to maintain a friendship around. It's been over 40 years now. I still live in the area, though I moved into the city proper where there are always lights and people. I've never told anyone else the full story except my wife, and even she looks at me skeptically when I bring it up. Sometimes I drive out to Pelham Road during broad daylight. I park at a turnout and just stare into those woods, wondering if it's still out there or if there are more of them. Wondering if anyone would believe me even now, with all the strange videos and stories on the internet. I don't know what we saw that night in 1978. I don't have a scientific explanation. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes. A creature that shouldn't exist, that defied everything I understood about the world. A reptilian humanoid that felt no pain when struck, that moved with impossible speed and strength, that looked at me with intelligence behind those inhuman eyes. I keep the Polaroid of the claw marks in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out just to remind myself I'm not crazy, that it really happened. The photo has faded over the decades, but the evidence is still there. 4 distinct grooves that no human hand could make. Whatever it was, it changed my life forever. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist in the shadows just beyond the reach of our headlights. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you come face to face with them on a dark road at night, and nothing is ever the same again. Story 9. I still see that face sometimes when I close my eyes. It's been over 40 years now, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. I've kept quiet about it most of my life. Who would believe me anyway? But now that others have come forward with similar stories, I figure it's time I finally told mine. My name is Jessica Tanner. Back in August of 1978, I was 22 years old and dating a boy named Mike Colson. We'd been together about 8 months at that point. He was a good guy, worked at his dad's auto shop in town, and knew how to fix just about anything with an engine. It was a warm Saturday night, August 12th, and we'd just finished having dinner at Milligan's Diner in Smithville. Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries. Neither of us drank alcohol that night. Mike was saving up for a new transmission for his Dodge, and I was never much of a drinker anyway. We left the diner around 9:15 p.m. Mike's Dodge Charger was running smooth that summer, and we decided to take the long way back to my parents' place in Beamsville. That meant cutting through the farmland and wooded areas around Grimsby. It was something we did often, just cruising with the windows down, radio playing, and enjoying the night air. Nothing unusual about it. The night was clear, stars visible in patches between the trees that lined the country roads. Mike had the high beams on as we drove along Mud Street, where the woods got thick on both sides. We weren't talking much, just listening to foreigners hot-blooded on the radio. I remember that detail clearly. Funny how some things stick with you. It was about 9:30 p.m. when it happened. Mike had just taken a curve in the road, and we were on a straight stretch with dense forest on both sides. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating maybe 50 feet of asphalt and the tree line beyond. Something moved at the edge of the tree line on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. We'd seen plenty of them before, but this was bigger, much bigger. "Mike, watch out!" I yelled, pointing ahead. The thing burst out from the trees and ran directly across the road in front of us. Mike cursed and slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car fishtailed, and for a second I was sure we were going to hit it. But Mike swerved hard to the left, missing it by inches, and nearly sent us into the ditch on the opposite side of the road. The Charger shuddered to a stop, engine still running, headlights still pointed at the spot where the thing had crossed. And that's when it turned and looked right at us. I'll never forget what I saw in those headlights. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but it was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark brown hair or fur, thick and matted in places. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. This thing had broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, and a body shaped roughly like a human's. but much more powerful looking. And its face. God, its face. It had a sloped forehead that protruded over deep-set eyes that caught the headlights and reflected back with a reddish glow. Its nose was flat and wide, and its mouth was set in what looked like a permanent grimace, showing teeth that seemed too large for even that massive head. It stared at us for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods on the left side of the road, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The undergrowth rustled and snapped as it crashed through, and then there was silence, broken only by the sound of Mike and me breathing hard and the engine idling. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Did you see that?" I couldn't speak. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I just nodded. That couldn't have been... Mike started but couldn't finish. "A bear," I said, finally finding my voice. "It must have been a bear." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Bears don't look like that. Bears don't move like that. Mike shook his head. "That was no bear, Jess." We sat there for maybe 5 minutes, neither of us wanting to get out of the car, neither of us really wanting to keep driving either. Finally, Mike put the car in gear and eased us back onto the road. He drove slowly at first, then picked up speed, clearly wanting to get away from that place as quickly as possible. We didn't talk much on the way to my house. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something out of nightmares or bad sci-fi movies. When Mike pulled into my parents' driveway, he turned to me. "We should report this," he said. "Call the police or something." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And tell them what? That we saw a monster in the woods. They'll think we're crazy or on drugs." "It was a Bigfoot, Jess," Mike said, saying out loud what we'd both been thinking. "I don't know what else to call it. There's no other explanation for what we saw." "Do you hear yourself?" I asked. "A Bigfoot in Grimsby, Ontario? Come on, Mike." But I knew he was right. There was simply no other explanation for what we'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. It was a Bigfoot. There was no other word for it. We agreed to think about it overnight and talk again tomorrow. I went inside, told my parents I was tired, and went straight to my room. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking at me from the edge of the woods. The next day, Mike came over and we talked about it again. In the daylight, with the sun shining through my parents' kitchen window, it was easier to doubt ourselves. Maybe it was just a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the headlights had played tricks on us. Maybe we'd both somehow had the same hallucination at the same time. But deep down, we both knew what we'd seen. In the end, we decided not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of town, labeled as attention seekers or liars. So we kept it to ourselves, a secret between the two of us. Mike and I broke up about 6 months later. It wasn't because of what happened that night, at least not directly. But the experience had changed us both in ways we couldn't quite articulate. We'd shared something profound and terrifying, and somehow that created a distance between us that we couldn't bridge. I met Jim Tanner in 1981, and we got married the following year. For 3 years, I kept the story to myself. I didn't tell Jim. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. But one night in 1984, after we'd moved to our first house in Hamilton, I woke up screaming from a nightmare about that thing in the woods. Jim held me while I cried, and finally, I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, without judging. When I finished, he didn't tell me I was crazy or that I'd imagined it. He just asked questions. What exactly had it looked like? How had it moved? Where precisely had we seen it? "I believe you saw something, Jess," he said finally. "I don't know what it was, but I believe you." That was all I needed. Just one person who didn't think I was making it up or had been hallucinating. But still, we didn't tell anyone else. It became another secret, this time between Jim and me. Life went on. We had kids, 2 boys, Matt and Lucas. We moved a couple of times, eventually settling in Burlington. I got a job as a dental receptionist. Jim worked his way up to plant manager at a manufacturing company. The memory of that night faded, pushed to the background by the everyday concerns of raising a family and making a living. But it never completely went away. I'd still have dreams about it occasionally. I'd still find myself scanning the tree line when we drove through wooded areas at night, and whenever I heard stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I'd get a chill down my spine and change the channel or close the browser. Then, in 2015, something changed. Our boys were grown and out of the house by then. I was 61, retired, with time on my hands. One day, out of curiosity or maybe some need for closure, I typed Grimsby, Ontario Bigfoot into Google. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some generic information about Bigfoot legends in Canada. But what I found stopped me cold. There were reports, dozens of them, from people who claimed to have seen a large, hairy, bipedal creature in the woods around Grimsby and Beamsville. Some were recent, from the last 10 or 15 years, but others dated back to the 1970s and even earlier. One report in particular caught my eye. It was from a man named Robert Johnston, who claimed to have seen a large, hair-covered humanoid creature while camping near Grimsby in July 1978, just a month before Mike and I had our encounter. His description matched what we'd seen almost exactly. The height, the build, the deep-set eyes that reflected light. I read report after report, my hands shaking. There was one from 1982, from a woman who'd been hiking with her boyfriend and claimed they'd heard massive footsteps and deep, guttural breathing following them through the woods. Another from 1985, from a truck driver who said he'd nearly hit a giant hairy man thing on the QEW near Grimsby in the early morning hours. These people hadn't all hallucinated. They hadn't all made up the same lie. They'd seen something, the same thing Mike and I had seen that night in 1978. I showed Jim what I'd found. He read through the reports carefully, then looked at me. "You should share your story, Jess," he said. "These people have been brave enough to come forward with theirs. Maybe it's time you did the same." I wasn't sure at first. I'd kept this secret for almost 40 years. What would people think? What would our friends say? What would our sons think of their mother claiming she'd seen a Bigfoot? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized Jim was right. If I'd known back in 1978 that others had seen the same thing, it would have made a world of difference to me. Maybe my story could do that for someone else. So I wrote it all down. Exactly what Mike and I had seen that night. I posted it on one of the websites dedicated to Bigfoot sightings using my real name. It was terrifying, like standing naked in public. But it was also liberating. Within days, I received emails from others who'd had similar experiences, some in the same area we had, some elsewhere. But all described the same creature, tall, powerful, covered in dark hair, with those deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. One email was from a woman named Laura Peterson. She claimed to have seen the creature in almost the exact same spot as Mike and I, but in 1986. She'd kept it to herself all these years, too afraid of ridicule to tell anyone except her husband. "I thought I was going crazy," she wrote. "Reading your story made me cry. For the first time in my life, I don't feel alone with this." That's when I knew I'd made the right decision. I've spoken with many people now who've had similar encounters. Some are clearly making things up for attention, but others, you can tell from the way they describe what they saw, the details they include, the fear that still lingers in their voices. They saw something real. I'm 75 now, and I know most people still don't believe in Bigfoot. That's fine. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what Mike and I saw that night in 1978. I know it wasn't a bear or any other known animal. I know it wasn't a man in a costume or a hallucination. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the woods around Grimsby after all these years. I wonder if it has a family, others of its kind. I wonder if it remembers the two humans it nearly collided with on that warm August night, the way we certainly remember it. I don't drive through wooded areas at night anymore if I can help it. And when I do, I keep my eyes firmly on the road ahead, not wanting to glimpse something moving among the trees, because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some memories, no matter how many decades pass, never fade completely away. That face in the headlights, I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes, and I suspect I always will. Story 10. I was never one to believe in monsters, but I wasn't always right. My name's Elaine Wilson, and in 1986 I moved to a small rental house on Onion Lake Dam Road, about 15 minutes north of Thunder Bay. The house wasn't much, just a simple one-story place with wooden siding painted a fading blue and a small porch out front. The rent was cheap, and the location suited me fine. I could drive into the city when I needed to, but still enjoy the quiet of the woods and lake. My golden retriever, Rusty, loved the open space to run around, and I loved the peace. I'd grown up in northwestern Ontario, so the isolation didn't bother me. The dense forests, the long winters, the wildlife, it was all familiar. I knew the sounds of the woods at night, the hoot of owls, the howl of distant wolves, the rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. I knew what belonged in these woods and what didn't. Or at least I thought I did. It was mid-October, and the nights were getting colder. The trees had turned bright red and orange, and the air had that crisp smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke. I was sitting in my living room that evening, the sewing machine whirring as I worked on a quilt. The TV was on loud, some sitcom I wasn't really watching but kept on for background noise. Rusty lay at my feet, dozing. I glanced at the clock, 9:43 p.m. I had another hour of sewing in me before bed. That's when I noticed Rusty's behavior change. He lifted his head suddenly, ears perked up. Then his ears flattened against his skull, and he let out a low whine. I watched as he stood, hackles raised, staring at the front door. The whites of his eyes showed as he looked at me and then back at the door. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my foot easing off the sewing machine pedal. Rusty whined again, backing away from the door, tail tucked between his legs. I turned down the volume on the TV. That's when I heard it. A screech. But not just any screech. This was a sound that sent ice through my veins and made my skin prickle. It was high-pitched and guttural at the same time, like metal scraping on metal combined with something organic, something alive. It rose in pitch until it seemed impossible for any creature to make such a noise, then dropped to a low, rumbling growl before rising again in another hair-raising screech. And it was close. Not off in the distance, but right outside my house. I froze, my hand still resting on the fabric under the needle. Rusty pressed himself against my legs, trembling. The sound came again, moving now, circling the house. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The screech was unlike anything I'd ever heard in all my years in northwestern Ontario. It wasn't a wolf or a bear or a moose. It wasn't a loon or an eagle or a hawk. I tried to tell myself it was just a screech owl. They make unsettling sounds that can scare people who aren't familiar with them. But I knew that wasn't it. I knew the sound of a screech owl. This was something else. The noise stopped abruptly. The sudden silence felt oppressive, pressing in on my ears. I stood completely still, listening. Nothing. Even the normal night sounds, the insects, the distant call of an owl, had disappeared. The woods were unnaturally quiet. I walked to the window, Rusty following close behind, still whimpering. I pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. The yard was dimly lit by the porch light, casting long shadows across the leaf-strewn ground. Beyond that was just blackness, the tree line a dark wall that seemed to watch me. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I checked that my doors and windows were locked, then sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. Rusty refused to leave my side for the rest of the night. I left the TV on but couldn't focus on my sewing anymore. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, expecting to hear that awful sound again. But it never came back. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been some strange animal, maybe a fisher or a lynx in distress. Something unusual, but explainable. I went to bed that night, with Rusty curled up beside me, instead of in his usual spot at the foot of the bed. Neither of us slept well. The next morning I went outside to check around the house. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, making it impossible to see if anything had left tracks. Everything looked normal. No signs of disturbance, no evidence that anything unusual had been there. Life went on. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Snow came early that year, blanketing the ground by mid-November. I didn't hear the strange screech again, and as time passed, the memory of it faded, not gone, but pushed to the back of my mind, filed away as one of those unexplained things that happen sometimes when you live in the wilderness. Then, in January, I noticed problems with the plumbing. At first, it was just the bathtub draining slowly. I used drain cleaner thinking it was just hair clogging the pipes. But then, the kitchen sink started backing up too. Water would sit in the basin for hours before slowly draining away. I called my landlord, Bill Tanner, a gruff, practical man in his 60s who'd lived in Thunder Bay his whole life. He came out the next day, frowning as he inspected the drains. "Pipes might be frozen," he said, wiping his hands on a rag after testing the kitchen sink. "It's been cold enough. I'll need to check the crawl space." He brought a flashlight and a toolbox from his truck, then opened the small access door to the crawl space on the side of the house. The door was only about 2 feet square, just big enough for someone to squeeze through if they didn't mind the tight fit. Bill shined his flashlight inside, then let out a low whistle. "What the hell?" he muttered. "What is it?" I asked, standing behind him, peering over his shoulder. The beam of light illuminated a strange sight. The crawl space under my house was just a dirt floor with concrete foundation walls and floor joists supporting the house above. But the dirt wasn't where it should be. All the earth had been moved from one side of the crawl space and piled up on the other, creating a mound about 3 feet high on one side and leaving the other side completely bare, exposing pipes that should have been buried. "Did you do this?" Bill asked, turning to look at me with narrowed eyes. "No. Why would I crawl under there and move dirt around?" I replied, shocked at what I was seeing. "Someone's been under there," he said, shining the light around the space. "See those pipes? They're exposed to the cold now. That's why they're freezing." "But who would do that?" I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the January air. Bill shrugged. "Kids, maybe? Someone playing a prank?" But we both knew that made no sense. The access door hadn't been disturbed, no footprints in the snow around it, no signs that it had been opened recently until Bill had just done so. And what kind of prank involved crawling into the tight, dirty space beneath a house just to move dirt from one side to the other? "I'll fix the pipes," Bill said after a moment. "Gonna have to thaw them out and insulate them better. But that dirt—" He shook his head. "I don't know what to tell you about that." He spent the afternoon working on the pipes, crawling in and out of the crawl space. I made him coffee and watched from the kitchen window as he worked, my mind racing with possibilities. None of them made sense. "Pipes should be fine now," Bill said as he packed up his tools, "but you might want to think about getting someone to level out that dirt under there. It's not good having it all piled up like that. Could cause moisture problems." I nodded, thanking him, but I had no intention of crawling under the house myself, and I wasn't sure who I'd hire to do such a job. Besides, Something told me not to disturb whatever had moved that dirt in the first place. The plumbing worked fine after Bill's repairs. Winter continued, harsh and long, as it always is in northwestern Ontario. Spring came late, with the snow lingering into April. When it finally melted, revealing the dead grass and soggy earth beneath, I almost forgot about the strange occurrences of the previous year. Almost. It wasn't until years later, when I'd moved away from that house on Onion Lake Dam Road, that I began connecting the dots. It happened during a conversation with a friend who mentioned hearing strange noises in the woods near her cabin. "It was this awful screech," she said, "like nothing I've ever heard before." The memory hit me like a physical force. That sound outside my house, Rusty's fear, the inexplicably moved earth beneath the floorboards. A chill ran down my spine as I realized for the first time that these events might be connected. I started researching, looking into local legends, folklore, unexplained phenomena in the Thunder Bay area. I found stories, not many but enough to make me wonder, of strange creatures in the northern forests, beings that made unearthly sounds, that dug into the earth, that could move through the ground like fish through water. The local Ojibwe had stories of underground dwellers, spirits that lived in the earth. Miners told tales of hearing strange noises in the depths of the shafts, of finding tunnels they hadn't dug. Hunters spoke in hushed tones of things glimpsed at twilight that moved in ways no natural animal should. I thought of that cold January day, looking into the crawl space beneath my house, seeing the dirt moved from one side to the other. Had something been making a nest? A den? Had something been living under my house while I slept just a few feet above, separated only by thin floorboards? And that screech, had it been a warning? A territorial call? Had Rusty sensed what I couldn't, known instinctively that something was there that shouldn't be? I'll never know for certain what was under my house that winter. I never saw anything with my own eyes besides the mysteriously moved earth. But I know what I heard that October night, a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that still sometimes wakes me from sleep, my heart pounding, sweat cold on my skin. Whatever made that sound, whatever moved the earth beneath my house, it was something unexplainable. Something Rusty had sensed that night, something that had made its temporary home beneath my floorboards. I don't live on Onion Lake Dam Road anymore. I moved back to the city where the only things under the floors are concrete foundations and basement rooms. Sometimes I wonder about the people who live in that house now. I wonder if they've heard the screeching in the night. I wonder if they've checked their crawl space. Most of all, I wonder if it's still there, burrowing through the earth, making its way slowly through the forests of northwestern Ontario. And I wonder if it's alone. Anishiyom. Story 11. My hands still shake when I think about it. Even now, 30 years after what happened on that trail, I wake up some nights with the smell of it burning in my nostrils. It was 1993, and I'd just turned 14 that summer. Living in Fort Frances meant growing up fast when it came to the outdoors. Most boys my age had been hunting with their dads for years already. I was no different, except this was my first time going out alone. Just me and Rusty, my scrappy little mixed-breed dog. September 18th. I remember the date because I'd marked it on my calendar weeks in advance. Solo hunting day. Dad had finally agreed I was ready. "Don't go farther than the 4th trail," he'd warned that morning, helping me load the shotgun before dawn. "And be back by noon." I nodded, too excited to really listen. Rusty danced around my feet as I pulled on my boots. "That dog's braver than most men," Dad said with a laugh. "Saw him chase off that black bear last spring. Damn near gave your mother a heart attack." He wasn't wrong. 40 pounds of pure courage, that dog. I'd seen him square up to a bull moose once without so much as a flinch. Rusty feared nothing. We set out just as the sun was coming up around 7 a.m. The air had that crisp fall feel to it, not quite cold enough for frost, but with that unmistakable chill that meant winter wasn't far off. Dew coated the long grass along the paths, soaking my jeans below the knee within minutes. The first 3 trails yielded nothing, a few distant bird calls, but nothing within range. Rusty trotted ahead of me, occasionally circling back as if to ask why we weren't finding anything. I remember checking my watch, 9:15 a.m. We'd been out for over 2 hours with nothing to show for it. "Let's try the North Trail," I told Rusty, who wagged his tail in agreement. The 4th trail cut deeper into the woods than the others. Dad rarely took me this far when we hunted together. Not because it was dangerous, but because the game wasn't usually worth the extra hike. Still, I wanted to prove I could handle it. The trail narrowed as we pushed forward, tall grass, 3 feet high in places, crowding in from both sides. 30 minutes in, I noticed Rusty's behavior change. He'd been ranging ahead like usual, but suddenly he dropped back, sticking close to my heels. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, reaching down to scratch his ears. That's when I first noticed the smell, like wet dog, but wrong somehow, mixed with something rotten, like garbage left too long in the sun. I figured maybe we were near a dead animal. Wouldn't be unusual. Coyotes sometimes left their kills. The farther we went, the stronger the smell got. Rusty pressed against my legs, something I'd never seen him do before. His ears were flat against his head. "It's okay," I told him, though I was starting to feel uneasy myself. The smell intensified with each step. It was thick in the air now, almost making me gag. Rusty whined, a high, frightened sound I'd never heard from him before. Then it happened. Without warning, Rusty bolted, not forward on the trail, but backward, the way we'd come. He ran like something was chasing him, his tail tucked so far between his legs it disappeared. "Rusty!" I called after him. "Rusty, come back!" My voice echoed through the trees. Nothing but silence answered. That's when I heard it. A rustling in the tall grass to my left. Not the light movement of a small animal. This was deliberate, heavy. The grass parted slightly, waving against whatever was moving through it. I froze, my shotgun half raised. The rustling stopped. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then it stood up. The grass parted and something rose from its hiding place, not 20 feet from where I stood. My first thought was bear, but that thought died instantly. This was no bear. It was massive, towering. I stand 6 feet tall, and this thing was considerably taller, 7 feet at least, maybe more. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its upper body built like a weightlifter, but bigger than any human could ever be. And it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but dense, dark, reddish-black hair that covered its entire body. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice, a face that was almost human, but horribly wrong. Dark eyes, greyish-black like wet stones, set deep under prominent brow ridges. No whites visible, just those dark orbs staring at me from a face that seemed molded from nightmares. Its lips were brownish-red like old blood, pulled back slightly to reveal teeth I couldn't fully see in the shadow of its face. It looked at me, directly at me. There was intelligence in those eyes, recognition, awareness. I couldn't move. My finger wouldn't pull the trigger. My legs wouldn't run. I just stood there, 14 years old, staring into the face of something that shouldn't exist. The creature held my gaze for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then, with casual deliberation, it stepped onto the trail. It moved with impossible grace for something so large. The trail was littered with hidden obstacles, fallen logs, rocks, uneven ground, but it crossed in what seemed like 2 or 3 strides, never looking down, never breaking stride, and it made no sound, none. No cracking twigs, no rustling leaves, complete silence. Just that smell, growing stronger as it passed in front of me, not 30 feet away. It disappeared into the tall grass on the other side of the trail. The grass swayed, then stilled. I don't know how long I stood there. 1 minute, 5. The shotgun had grown heavy in my hands, but I couldn't lower it. I couldn't do anything. Rusty. The thought finally broke through my paralysis. My dog was out there somewhere, terrified. I turned and ran. Not a controlled jog, but a full-out, panic-driven sprint. My boots pounded the dirt. My breath came in ragged gasps. I stumbled once, nearly fell, caught myself and kept going. Behind me, distantly, I heard the crack of breaking branches, large ones, like something big was moving away through the forest. I didn't look back. I found Rusty waiting at the junction of the third trail, trembling from nose to tail. When he saw me, he didn't bound over like usual. He cowered, whining softly. "It's okay," I gasped, kneeling beside him. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Nothing was okay. We made it home by 10:30. Dad was surprised to see us back so early. "No luck?" he asked, noticing my empty game bag. I shook my head. I couldn't tell him, couldn't form the words. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mom said when I walked into the kitchen. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just tired," I managed to say. "Going to lie down." I didn't hunt again for 2 years after that. Dad didn't push it, figured it was just teenage interests changing. When I finally did go back out, I stayed on the first trail only. I never went near the fourth trail again. Never will. Rusty changed after that day, too. The dog that would challenge bears became nervous outdoors. He'd bark at shadows, growl at nothing. He lived another 8 years, but he never went into the woods with me again. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen for a long time. Who would believe me? A 14-year-old kid claiming he'd seen some kind of monster in the woods? I'd be laughed out of school. It was 5 years later when I heard the first story that made me think I wasn't crazy. I was working at Miller's gas station the summer after high school graduation. Old Bill Carpenter came in one morning looking shaken. He pumped his gas, then came inside and bought a coffee. His hands were trembling. "You okay, Mr. Carpenter?" I asked. He glanced around, making sure we were alone. "Saw something strange out by the North Woods this morning," he said quietly. "Driving back from my sister's place in Thunder Bay. Big as a house it was. Crossed the road about a quarter-mile ahead of my truck." My mouth went dry. "What did it look like?" "Couldn't see clearly in the headlights. Tall, though. Covered in dark hair. Moved too fast for something that size." He took a sip of coffee. "Thought it might be a bear at first, but bears don't walk on 2 legs like that. Not for that distance." I wanted to tell him then. The words were right there, but I didn't. 2 months later, the Jenkins brothers came into the station talking about strange tracks they'd found while hunting. "Bigger than any bear print," the older one said, "and the stride length had to be 8 feet between steps." The stories continued. Never many, just 1 or 2 a year, always from the northern trails, always describing something similar. I moved away for college the following year, went to school in Minneapolis, tried to put it all behind me. I studied biology, thinking maybe I could find rational explanations for what I'd seen. Nothing in my textbooks came close. I dated a girl named Sandra for a while. One night, after too many beers, I told her about what I'd seen in the woods. She laughed, thought I was making it up. We broke up 2 weeks later. I didn't tell anyone else for a long time. In 2005, I moved back to Fort Francis. My parents were getting older, and I'd found work as a park ranger of all things. The irony wasn't lost on me. My first week back, I ran into Mike Donahue at the grocery store. We'd been in the same grade at school. "Tyler Harrison," he said, slapping me on the back. "Heard you were back in town." We caught up briefly. Then he lowered his voice. "Hey, you remember those stories about the thing in the North Woods? The ones that started back when we were in high school?" My heart skipped. "What about them?" "My cousin Terry saw it last month. Or something, anyway. He was up near the old logging road with his dog. Said it was at least 7 feet tall, covered in reddish hair. His dog went crazy, then ran off. Found it cowering under his truck when he got back. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You okay?" Mike asked. "Yeah," I managed. "Just remembered I forgot something." "Good seeing you, Mike." I walked out of the store without buying anything. That night, I finally told my dad. We were sitting on the porch watching the sun set. Mom had gone to bed early. "Dad," I said, "remember that day I went hunting alone, when I was 14? He nodded, sipping his beer. "Sure, you came back early. Didn't go again for a couple years after that." There was a reason. I took a deep breath. I saw something that day. I told him everything, the smell, Rusty running, the creature standing up in the grass, its silent movement across the trail, those eyes looking at me. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You think I'm crazy?" I said finally. He shook his head slowly. No, I don't." "You don't?" Dad set his beer down. "There've always been stories, Tyler. My father heard them from his father. The loggers had stories back in the 30s. The native folks have their own names for it. Why didn't you ever say anything?" He shrugged. "What was there to say? Never saw anything myself. Just tracks once, back in 78. Big ones. But I heard enough stories from men I trusted to know there's something out there. Why didn't you warn me? Would you have believed me?" He picked up his beer again. "Some things you have to see for yourself, or not see at all. I've been back in Fort Francis for 18 years now. I'm married with 2 kids of my own. My wife knows about what happened. She believes me, though she's never seen anything herself. My job as a park ranger takes me into the woods regularly. I've never gone back to that 4th trail. Never will. But I've found tracks over the years. Large branches broken too high for a bear to reach. Strange hair samples that don't match any known animal. Last year, my son turned 14. He asked if he could go hunting alone, just like I had at his age. Not yet, I told him. We'll go together for a few more years. He doesn't know why I'm so protective. Doesn't know what's out there in the tall grass. Maybe he never will. But sometimes, when the wind blows from the north, I catch a whiff of something, that same putrid smell of wet dog and garbage, and I know it's still out there, moving silently through the woods, watching with those dark, knowing eyes. I don't know what it was that I saw that day in 1993. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Wendigo. The names don't matter. What matters is that it was real. It saw me, and I saw it. And sometimes I think it remembers me too. Story 12. The cold bit through my flannel shirt as I sat motionless on the mossy log. October in Washington state isn't kind to old bones, but I'd been perched there since dawn, waiting for the salmon. My right eye socket, long empty and covered with a weathered patch, sometimes ached in this damp. Folks in Mineral called me One-Eye Charlie Wonnie on account of that card game back in '87. Lost more than my eye that night, lost my wedding ring, my truck, and nearly my dignity. But that's another story. I shifted my weight carefully, trying not to snap any twigs. The Nisqually River bubbled past, its current strong after the autumn rains. This spot, about 3 miles from where any reasonable hiking trail ended, had been my secret fishing hole for nearly 30 years. The isolation suited me fine. The mist hung low over the water, the kind that makes shapes in the trees seem like something else. Something watching. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know when I was alone and when I wasn't. This morning, I wasn't. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get black bears through here regular as Sunday church. The dark shape on the opposite bank stood tall, though. Too tall. 7 feet at least, broader at the shoulder than any man I'd known. I froze instinctively, my one good eye fixed on the figure. Then it moved. I've seen plenty in these woods. Cougars, elk, even a wolverine once, but nothing moved like this creature. Quick but deliberate, powerful but eerily silent. It stepped into the shallow edge of the river, and that's when I saw it wasn't alone. 3 more figures, nearly identical, emerged from the tree line behind it. My heart hammered against my ribs. The stories the Nisqually tribe told about the hidden ones, I'd always half believed them, the way you believe in the possibility of winning the lottery. You know it happens, just not to you. The tallest one, I guessed it was male, waded deeper into the current. His body was completely covered in dark brown hair, matted in some places, especially around what must have been shoulders. The hair on his head hung longer, maybe 6 inches, draping over what little I could see of his face. I didn't dare move, not even to reach for the small disposable camera in my tackle box. One wrong sound, and I knew they'd vanish. The largest Sasquatch stood perfectly still in the water, hands outstretched, waiting. The others spread out, forming a semicircle downstream. They were hunting, no fishing. A flash of silver shot through the water. A Chinook salmon, must have been 20 pounds. In a movement faster than I could track, the creature's massive hands plunged into the river and emerged with the thrashing fish. I'd seen bears fish before, clumsy and splashing. This was different, precise, calculated. The Sasquatch inspected the salmon, turned it in his hands, then made a low grunting sound. The others responded with similar noises. He waded back to shore and laid the fish on a flat rock. With methodical movements, he used what looked like a sharp stone to gut it. No wasted motion, no excessive force, just clean efficiency. For the next hour, I watched them catch 4 more salmon. Never more, just enough. After the 5th fish, the largest one made a different sound, deeper, more resonant, and they all backed away from the river. They divided the fish between them. There were 5 creatures in total. I counted 2 smaller ones hanging back near the tree line, juveniles probably. A family unit. I remembered old Jim Kitsap, who ran the sporting goods store, telling me his grandfather's stories about the hidden ones. They move in families, he'd said. See one alone, that's bad medicine. See a family, that's a blessing. Well, I'd just been blessed 5 times over. They ate some of the fish raw, right there on the bank. The rest they wrapped in large leaves, skunk cabbage probably, and tucked them away in what looked like crude pouches hanging at their sides. What struck me most wasn't their size or even their unexpected presence. It was their purpose. These weren't mindless animals. They communicated, coordinated, shared. They took exactly what they needed, no more. In 30 years of watching fishermen strip these rivers clean when the salmon run, I'd never seen such restraint. One of the smaller ones, couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, suddenly turned in my direction. I stopped breathing. Its face, what I could see of it beneath the hair, had a flatter nose than ours, heavy brow ridges. But the eyes were alert, intelligent. It stared right at my position for 10 long seconds. I didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there becoming one with that log. The little one made a soft hooting sound. The largest one, maybe the father, turned as well. He stared at me or through me for what felt like forever. Then he simply nodded. A deliberate up and down motion of his massive head. He knew I was there. He'd known all along. With another series of grunts and hoots, he led his family back into the dense forest. Within seconds, they'd disappeared completely. No broken branches, no disturbed underbrush, just gone. I sat there for another hour, my legs cramped and my heart still racing. I'd just seen what countless expeditions had failed to find, what most of mineral Washington would laugh about over beers at Thatcher's bar. Sasquatch? Bobby Miller nearly spat his coffee across the counter at Dora's diner. You been hitting the moonshine again, Charlie? I know what I saw, Bobby. I shoveled eggs into my mouth, not looking up. It had been 3 days since my encounter, and I'd finally decided to tell someone. Bad decision, clearly. Sure you do, Bobby winked at Dora, who was wiping down the counter. Just like you saw that 3-headed trout last summer. That was different. I never said it had 3 heads. I said it had a deformed jaw. And now you've seen Bigfoot, not just one, but a whole family of them, playing house and fishing like it's some kind of Sasquatch Sunday picnic. I pushed my plate away. They weren't playing anything. They were surviving, doing it a hell of a lot better than most of us, too. Bobby's face softened a bit. He'd known me for 20 years, ever since I pulled his youngest out of Miller Creek during the flood of '81. Look, Charlie, I'm not saying you're lying, just saying maybe it was bears. Light plays tricks in those woods. Bears don't stand 7 feet tall on 2 legs for an hour. Bears don't use tools to clean fish. Bears don't wrap their leftover dinner in skunk cabbage leaves for later. Dora leaned over the counter. Her grey hair was pinned up in the same tight bun she'd worn since I first came to Mineral. My granddaddy used to talk about them, called them the Hidden Ones, said they were guardians of the river. Bobby rolled his eyes. Here we go with the Indian legends. Nisqually legends, Dora corrected, her voice sharp. Her grandmother had been full-blooded Nisqually. They said the Hidden Ones keep balance, take too many salmon, they notice, cut too many trees, they notice. Well, they've been mighty quiet about the Simpson logging operation then, Bobby snorted. I finished my coffee in silence. I knew what I'd seen. Didn't much matter if Bobby or anyone else believed me. I returned to that spot on the Nisqually every morning for 2 weeks. Nothing. No sign of the Sasquatch family. But I noticed other things I'd overlooked before. Stone formations that couldn't be natural. 3 rocks stacked in specific patterns near trails. Broken branches that formed arrows, pointing to the richest berry patches. Signs, maybe. Communication. On the 15th day, I brought a small package. Inside was half a fresh-caught salmon I'd smoked myself, wrapped in clean butcher paper. I placed it on the flat rock where I'd seen them prepare their fish. Then I retreated to my log and waited. Nothing happened that day, or the next. On the 3rd day, the package was gone. In its place sat a perfect sphere of woven cedar bark, about the size of a baseball. A trade, a communication. I kept that cedar ball in my pocket every day after that. Sometimes I'd take it out, run my fingers over its intricate weave, and wonder about those hands that made it. Hands strong enough to catch 20-pound salmon mid-leap, yet dexterous enough to create something this delicate. There's some university folks in town, Jim Kitsap told me when I stopped by his store for fishing line that November, asking about Sasquatch sightings up by the river. My stomach tightened. What did you tell them? Nothing much. Said there's always stories. Set them up toward Mount Rainier. He gave me a knowing look. Figured that's far enough away from your spot. I nodded my thanks. Jim understood. His grandfather's stories weren't just entertainment, they were warnings, instructions. The hidden ones stayed hidden for a reason. But as winter set in and logging companies pushed further up the Nisqually watershed, I started to worry. The salmon runs grew smaller each year. The clear cuts crept closer to the deep forests. What would happen to the hidden ones when there was nowhere left to hide? December brought the heaviest snow in 20 years. I still made my way to the river when I could, though less often. The cold was harder on my 63-year-old joints than it used to be. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, I trudged through knee-deep snow to reach my spot. I wasn't expecting to see them. Just felt right to be there. The river had partially frozen along the edges. The forest was silent, except for the occasional crack of branches heavy with snow. I sat on my log, now covered with a white blanket, and unwrapped a thermos of coffee. That's when I heard it. A low, melodic humming from across the river. Not one voice, but several, creating harmonies that made the hair on my neck stand up. Through the falling snow, I made out 5 figures standing in a semicircle at the river's edge. The Sasquatch family. They weren't fishing now. The salmon were long gone until spring. They were singing, calling. Their massive bodies swayed slightly with the rhythm. I sat transfixed as their song echoed through the forest. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter somehow. When they finished, the largest one, the one I'd come to think of as the father, turned and looked directly at me. This time I raised my hand in greeting, slowly, deliberately. He raised his in return. Then they were gone, melting into the snowy forest, as if they'd never been there at all. By spring, I'd made my decision. When Dr. Margaret Fulton from the Pacific Northwest Primate Research Center came to Mineral asking questions, I agreed to meet her. Not at my fishing spot, never there. But at my cabin, where I laid out what I knew, what I'd seen. Mr. Wani, these observations are extraordinary, she said, her recorder running between us on my kitchen table. You understand why the scientific community would be skeptical. Don't care much about skepticism, Dr. Fulton. Care about those creatures. And you believe they're under threat? I nodded. The logging's pushing everything back. The salmon runs get smaller every year. They're guardians of something we're destroying. She studied me with sharp eyes. Smart woman. Why tell me this now? You've kept this secret for months. Because there's worse folks looking. Trophy hunters. Those TV shows with their cameras and noise. Simpson Logging has plans to clear-cut right up to the river next year. I leaned forward. I'd rather have someone who might understand looking out for them than someone who just wants to stuff and mount one. Dr. Fulton turned off her recorder. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Wani? A protected area. No logging, no development. Call it habitat preservation for the salmon if you have to. Just leave enough forest for them to stay hidden. Based solely on your testimony, that's a hard sell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cedar ball, placed it on the table between us. I have this, and I know where they fish, where they live. I can show you evidence, not them, never them, but enough to make your case. She picked up the woven sphere, turning it over in her hands. Her eyes widened as she examined the precise patterning. This isn't human work, she whispered. No, ma'am, it's not. It took 2 years of surveys, petitions, and battles with lumber companies. Dr. Fulton found more evidence. Hair samples, unusual footprints, fish bones cut with tools unlike anything documented. She never saw the hidden ones herself. I made sure of that. But she found enough to convince the right people. In 2003, the Upper Nisqually watershed became a protected ecological reserve, officially for the preservation of wild salmon habitat, unofficially for the preservation of something much rarer. I still go to my spot on the river. I'm slower now, need a walking stick to navigate the trail. Sometimes, when the salmon are running, I catch glimpses of them. The family has grown. There's another small one now, toddling along the riverbank while the others fish. Last week, I found another cedar ball on my log, bigger than the first, with patterns even more complex. Inside was a perfect salmon vertebra, polished smooth. The folks in Mineral still call me One-Eye Charlie. Still smile when I mention the hidden ones. That's fine by me. Bobby Miller died last winter. On his deathbed, he squeezed my hand and whispered, I saw one, Charlie. Up by Goat Creek, standing in the mist. You were right. I just nodded. The hidden ones don't need our belief. They've been here long before us, might be here long after. All they need is space to remain hidden and enough salmon to feed their families. Some nights, when the moon is full, I hear their singing floating across the river. I don't understand the words, but I understand the meaning well enough. It's the song of those who belong to a place so completely that they become its guardians. I won't be around much longer to watch over them, but I've made sure others will. Dr. Fulton trains new researchers every year, teaching them to observe without intruding, to protect without exposing. The hidden ones of Nisqually River will stay hidden just as they should be. Story 13. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get the damn tent stakes in the ground. August 1961 was turning out to be the hottest summer in Bainbridge that anyone could remember. Sweat soaked through my Boy Scout uniform as I struggled with the canvas tent. The backs of my hands were already sunburned, but I didn't care. This was my chance to earn my Wilderness Survival Merit Badge, and I was determined to do it right. My name is Thomas Mitchell. I was 14 years old that summer, gangly and awkward with a mop of brown hair that my mother was always trying to tame. I'd picked this spot 3 days earlier while hiking with my troop. It was perfect, secluded enough to feel like real wilderness, but only about 2 miles from the main road if anything went wrong. The campsite sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woodland. A natural spring bubbled up from between some rocks about 50 yards away, creating a small pool before trickling off downhill. Old oaks, maples, and beech trees provided shade, and there was plenty of deadfall for firewood. The ground was relatively flat, with a slight slope for drainage. Scoutmaster Jenkins had approved it for my 3-day solo camping trip after I'd shown him the location on the map. "This stake is bent," I muttered to myself, tossing it aside and digging in my pack for another. The air was thick and still under the canopy of trees. Birds called to each other overhead, and insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Normal forest sounds that I'd been listening to all my life growing up in rural New York. I'd spent the morning setting up camp, gathering firewood, and preparing a fire pit with stones I'd collected from the stream. After lunch, a sandwich my mum had packed, I decided to fill my canteens at the spring. The camping manual said to always keep fresh water on hand, and I was taking every instruction seriously. I grabbed both empty canteens and headed through the brush toward the spring. It was about 1 in the afternoon, and the sun filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns on the forest floor. The temperature had to be in the high 80s, and the humidity made it feel even hotter. About halfway to the spring, I heard it. A rustling sound coming from the direction of the water. My first thought was deer. They often came to springs like this to drink, especially in the heat of the day. A deer sighting would be something cool to write in my camping journal. I slowed my pace, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs. Dad had taught me how to move quietly in the woods during our hunting trips. "Heel first, then roll to the toe," he always said. I followed his advice now, creeping forward through the underbrush. The rustling continued. I ducked behind a large oak tree, peering around it toward the spring. The sound seemed to be coming from the far side, where the trees grew thicker and the canopy created deep shadows. I took another step forward, keeping low. My heart beat faster with excitement at the thought of seeing a deer up close. Maybe I could even snap a picture with the Kodak camera my parents had given me for my birthday. I pushed aside a branch and froze. It wasn't a deer. About 50 to 100 feet away, standing among the trees near the spring, was something I couldn't immediately identify. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. It stood upright. That was the first thing that registered. Not on 4 legs like a bear, but on 2 legs like a man. But it wasn't a man. The creature was coal black from head to toe, with a coat of hair that glistened in the filtered sunlight. It stood directly facing me, perfectly still, except for a slight swaying motion from side to side. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. They weren't. The thing was massive across the shoulders, far broader than any man I'd ever seen. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, with virtually no neck visible. The head was rounded, almost human-like in its shape, but completely covered in that same black hair. What hit me hardest, what sent the first real jolt of fear through my body, were its eyes. From within the shadows of the trees, they reflected a brilliant yellow like 2 small flashlights shining through the darkness. They stared directly at me from within the mass of hair that covered its face. I couldn't make out any features, no nose, no mouth, just those eyes peering through the curtain of black hair that draped over what should have been a face. Its arms hung at its sides, long and powerful looking. I couldn't see below its torso because of the thick brush between us, but what I could see was enough to tell me this was something I'd never encountered before. It stood about 6 feet tall, with a broad trunk that tapered slightly at what I assumed was its waist. We stared at each other across the small clearing. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, even the breeze seemed to have died away. My mouth went dry. The canteens dangled forgotten from my hands. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The creature continued to sway slightly from side to side, its yellow eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine, despite the summer heat. I don't know how long we stayed like that, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Time seemed to stop in that moment. Then a single thought cut through my paralysis. Run! I took one step backward, then another. The creature didn't move, but its eyes tracked me. I kept backing up slowly until I felt I was far enough away to turn. Then I spun and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Branches whipped my face. I tripped over roots and scrambled back to my feet without pausing. The canteens bounced against my legs as I sprinted through the woods. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, my lungs burning and legs trembling. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and stuffed whatever I could reach inside, my sleeping bag, some food, my compass. I left the half-assembled tent and the rest of my gear behind. As I shouldered my pack, I heard it. A sound from the direction of the spring, a low, moaning call that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling like some terrible wind instrument. That was enough for me. I ran again, this time heading directly for the trail that would take me back to the road. I didn't look back once. When I finally reached the main road, I was scratched, bruised, and completely out of breath. I followed the asphalt for about half a mile until I reached Wilkins' General Store, where I used their phone to call my parents. Dad arrived 30 minutes later in our Chevy pickup, his face creased with worry. "Tommy, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I climbed into the truck and slammed the door. "Drive, Dad. Please just drive." He gave me a long look, then started the engine. "Your stuff still up there?" I nodded, staring straight ahead at the road. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. "We'll go back tomorrow and get it," he said. "No!" The word burst out of me with such force that Dad actually jumped in his seat. "I'm not going back there, not ever." Dad drove in silence for a few minutes, occasionally glancing over at me. "You want to tell me what happened?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I tell him what I'd seen? He'd think I was crazy or lying. Hell, I almost thought I was crazy. I saw something in the woods, I finally managed. "A bear?" Dad asked, his voice serious now. I shook my head. "Not a bear. Something else. Something..." I couldn't find the words. Dad didn't push. He knew me well enough to see I was truly scared, not just making up stories. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring at me through the black hair. I heard that moaning call echoing through the trees. My mother brought me hot chocolate and sat on the edge of my bed, running her hand through my hair like she did when I was little. "Whatever it was, you're safe now," she said. But I didn't feel safe. I felt like something fundamental had changed in my world, like I'd seen behind a curtain that was never meant to be pulled back. The next day, Dad and Uncle Pete went to retrieve my camping gear. They came back with everything neatly packed up. "Place looked fine," Dad said. "No sign of bears or anything else. You probably just spooked yourself being alone out there." I nodded, not arguing. What was the point? For weeks afterward, I jumped at shadows and couldn't stand to be outside after dark. My parents worried. They took me to Dr. Farrell in town, who said I was suffering from an acute stress reaction and that it would pass with time. It didn't pass. Not completely. School started in September, and I went through the motions of normal life. I rejoined my scout troop but made excuses whenever camping trips were planned. I stuck to activities that kept me in town, away from the deep woods. It was late October when Johnny Baxter cornered me after a scout meeting. "Hey, Mitchell," he said. falling into step beside me as I walked home. My cousin works for the Forest Service. He told me something interesting. I kept walking, not really in the mood for Johnny's usual nonsense. Yeah? Yeah. Johnny moved in front of me, walking backwards so he could see my face. He said a hunter reported seeing something weird up near Bald Mountain last week, something big and black that walked on 2 legs. I stopped dead in my tracks. What? Johnny grinned, knowing he'd hooked me. Guy said it was too big to be a man, had no neck and eyes that glowed in his flashlight beam. Sound familiar? My mouth went dry. How would it sound familiar to me? Because Jenkins told some of us what happened to you this summer, said you came running out of the woods like the devil himself was after you. I shoved past him and kept walking. Hey, Johnny called after me. I believe you, Mitchell. My cousin's buddy saw it too. I didn't stop. I didn't want to talk about it, especially not with Johnny Baxter. But that night, I sat at my desk and pulled out a notebook. I wrote down everything I could remember about that day, the location, the time, what the creature looked like, how it moved, the sound it made. I drew a crude sketch of what I'd seen. Then I hid the notebook in the bottom of my dresser drawer. Over the next few months I heard other stories. Most were just campfire tales that had been around forever, the kind you tell to scare younger kids. But some had details that matched what I'd seen. A logger who quit his job after spotting something watching him from the tree line. A family on a picnic who packed up and left when their children said a big hairy man was hiding behind the trees. I started collecting newspaper clippings from surrounding counties, reports of strange sounds in the night, unexplained tracks found in remote areas, livestock acting nervous for no apparent reason. My parents worried about my new obsession, but I told them it was just for a school project on local folklore. They seemed relieved that I was showing interest in something, even if it was odd. By spring of 1962, I had filled 3 notebooks with information. I'd created a map marking every reported sighting within a 100-mile radius of Bainbridge. There was a pattern, but I couldn't quite make sense of it yet. What I did know was that I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined what I saw that day by the spring. Other people had seen it too, or something very like it. The locals had different names for it. Some called it the Black Walker. Others referred to it as the Wood Devil. The older folks in the Algonquin community over in Norwich called it Wendigo, though that didn't quite fit the traditional description. I never used any of those names in my notes. To me, it was just the creature. Sometimes late at night, I thought about those yellow eyes watching me from the trees, and I wondered if it had a name for me too. Summer came around again, and the camping trips resumed for my scout troop. I made excuses. Summer school, a sprained ankle, helping my dad with projects around the house. Jenkins gave me disappointed looks but didn't push. "You can't avoid the woods forever, Thomas," he said after one meeting. "Whatever scared you last year, you need to face it." I nodded and mumbled something non-committal. But the truth was I had already decided to face it. Not with the troop, not with anyone else who might get hurt. I would go alone back to that same spot, not to camp, just to see, just to know for sure. The day I chose was hot and clear, just like that day the previous year. I told my parents I was going fishing at Miller's Pond with some friends. Instead, I rode my bike to the trailhead and hiked in, carrying only a day pack with water, a sandwich, and my camera. My heart pounded harder with each step deeper into the forest. Every sound made me jump, but I kept going, following the same path I'd taken a year before. When I reached the clearing where I'd set up camp, I stopped and listened. The forest sounds were normal. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the slight breeze. Nothing out of the ordinary. I moved cautiously toward the spring, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The spring bubbled up just as it had before, creating its small pool before trickling away downhill. I stood there for a long time, watching and waiting. Nothing happened, no creature appeared. No yellow eyes gleamed from the shadows. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt strangely disappointed. I had built this moment up in my mind for so long, and now it seemed like just another day in the woods. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd about one of the beech trees near the spring. Its smooth grey bark had been marked. I moved closer to examine it. 3 long scratches ran vertically up the trunk, about 7 feet off the ground. They were deep, cutting through the bark to the lighter wood beneath. They looked fresh, maybe only a day or 2 old. I reached out to touch them, then thought better of it and pulled my hand back. Instead, I took out my camera and snapped a picture. As I lowered the camera, I heard it, the snap of a branch breaking somewhere in the dense forest beyond the spring. Then another. Something large was moving through the trees. I didn't wait around to see what it was. I turned and walked quickly back toward the trail, resisting the urge to run. Only when I reached the main path did I allow myself to look back. The forest stood silent and still behind me. If anything had been there, it was gone now. Or it was watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I made it back to my bike and rode home, the camera with its undeveloped film secure in my pack. I never told anyone about going back there. I never showed the developed photograph to anyone either. The picture of those 3 long scratches on the beech tree, too high for any normal person to reach without a ladder. That was 60 years ago. I'm an old man now, with grandchildren of my own. I still live in upstate New York, though not in Bainbridge anymore. I've had a good life. College, career, family, normal stuff. But I've never gone camping again. Not once in all these years. And when my grandkids want to tell scary stories around a bonfire, I always find an excuse to head inside early. Because I know something they don't. I know that sometimes, deep in the woods where people rarely go, there are eyes watching from the shadows. Eyes that don't belong to any animal in the field guides or textbooks. I know because I've seen them, and once you've been seen in return, you're never quite the same again. Story 14. The dashboard clock read 6:37 p.m. when everything in my life changed. I'd made this drive dozens of times before. Highway 97 south of Lapine was just another stretch of asphalt cutting through Oregon's pine forests. Nothing special, just me, Margaret Reynolds, heading to my sister's place in Chiloquin after visiting my folks up north. The sun was sinking behind the tree line. Not quite dark yet, but that in-between time when shadows stretch and your headlights don't seem to do much good. I'd flicked them on anyway, more out of habit than necessity. The radio played some country song I didn't recognize, and I hummed along anyway, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel of my 2008 Toyota Camry. Traffic was sparse that evening. Every few minutes a car would pass, going the opposite direction, their headlights momentarily flooding my car with light before disappearing behind me. I'd seen maybe 2 other vehicles headed south in the past 20 minutes. I remember reaching to turn up the heat. October evenings get cold in central Oregon, and the car's thermometer read 42 degrees. The forest pressed in on both sides of the highway, dense ponderosa pines and lodgepole stretching back farther than I could see. That's when I saw the movement on my right. At first I thought it was a deer or elk. We get plenty of those darting across the highway, especially at dusk. I eased off the gas slightly, expecting whatever it was to cross in front of me. But it didn't cross. It ran alongside the road. I glanced at my speedometer, 35 Vast-Marf. Whatever was running was keeping pace easily, just beyond the shoulder. Something big, too big for a deer, too big for anything that should exist. My first clear view lasted maybe 2 seconds, a massive dark shape moving through the trees parallel to my car. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. When I looked again, it had moved closer to the road. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I recognized. It ran upright, on 2 legs, like a man, but not a man. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and strange in the car's interior. The figure burst from the tree line onto the highway shoulder, now fully visible in the gloaming light. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. 8 feet tall at least, covered in dark, matted hair, not fur, but hair like a human's, but thicker, longer, hanging in coarse tangles across its body. It ran with shocking fluidity for something so large, arms pumping, legs driving forward in powerful strides. Steam rose from its body in the cool air, little clouds of vapor marking its exertion. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. The words floated in my head, but they seemed absurd, childish. This was a real creature, muscles visibly bunching and extending under its hairy hide as it matched my car's speed without apparent effort. The creature, I couldn't think what else to call it, turned its head toward me as it ran. I felt a cold splash of terror hit my stomach. Its face was both animal and human, with a pronounced brow ridge shadowing deep-set eyes. Its nose was broad and flat, mouth a grim line beneath. The jaw was heavy, pronounced. I pressed the accelerator, nudging my speed to 40 meters per hour. The thing kept pace, still watching me. Then it did something that sends chills through me even now, months later. It bent at the waist while maintaining its run and leaned toward my car window, deliberately bringing its face level with mine. Our eyes met. Its eyes caught the last rays of sunlight and reflected back amber, like a predator's. They were intelligent eyes, calculating, aware, not the mindless stare of an animal. It was looking at me with purpose, with what I can only describe as curious hostility, like I was the anomaly, the thing that didn't belong on that stretch of highway. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound tore from my throat as those eyes bored into mine across a distance of maybe 3 feet, separated only by my car window. I could see details of its face now, wrinkles around the eyes, a scar or mark across its right cheek, nostrils flaring with each breath. Steam puffed from its mouth in rhythmic clouds. A truck approached from the opposite direction, headlights sweeping across us both. The driver didn't slow or honk or give any indication that he saw the nightmare running beside my car. The creature didn't even flinch at the passing vehicle. I jammed my foot down on the accelerator hard. The Camry lurched forward, engine whining in protest. 45 made Peterson. The creature matched my speed, still staring, still running with that impossible ground-eating stride. "Go away!" I screamed, pounding the steering wheel with one hand. "Leave me alone!" My speed ticked up. 48, 49, 50 miles mig. Finally, at 52 mph, the creature gave a last lingering look, then veered sharply off the road and back into the forest. I watched in my side mirror as its massive form disappeared among the trees, swallowed by the gathering darkness. I kept driving at 65 mph, 10 miles over the limit, all the way to Chiloquin. My hands shook so badly I could barely control the wheel. When I finally reached my sister Beth's driveway, I sat in the car for 5 full minutes, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. I didn't tell Beth that night. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. But the image of those eyes meeting mine wouldn't leave me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face peering into my car. On the 4th day, I called the local ranger station. I needed someone to know, even if they dismissed me as crazy. "Ma'am, could you repeat that?" Ranger Donohue's voice carried a practiced patience. He was a big man with a neat beard and a clipboard, sitting across from me at the ranger station near Chiloquin. "I know how it sounds," I said, my hands wrapped around a foam cup of terrible coffee. They still trembled slightly. "I wish I could tell you I was drunk or tired or making it up. I'm not saying that." He made a note on his clipboard. "We get reports of unusual wildlife sightings fairly often. Just trying to get the details straight. You said this occurred on Highway 97, south of Lapine." "Yes. About 15 miles south of town, I'd guess, where the highway runs close to the forest on both sides for that long stretch." "And you estimate the time as?" "Around 6:40 p.m. The sun was just about down." Donohue nodded, writing something else. "And you described the creature as approximately 8 feet tall?" "At least that." It was taller than my car by a good margin. Bipedal, walking on two legs, running on two legs, fast. It kept pace with my car at 45 miles per hour. That's not possible, is it? For known wildlife in this region? No, ma'am. His face remained neutral. You said it was covered in hair. Dark hair, brown or black, hard to tell in that light. Not like fur on a bear, more like human hair, but everywhere and thicker, matted in places. I took a sip of coffee to steady myself. It was muscular, very strong-looking. I could see the muscles moving under the hair as it ran. Donahue wrote for a long time after that description. I waited, watching his face for any sign that he thought I was crazy. You mentioned eye contact, he finally said. Can you elaborate on that? The memory made my stomach clench. It bent down while running and looked right at me through the window, deliberately. Its eyes reflected light like a cat's or a deer's, but amber-colored, and the way it looked at me, I swallowed hard. It wasn't just seeing me, it was studying me. There was intelligence there. Did it make any sounds, calls, growls, anything? No, silent the whole time. And it eventually veered off when you reached about 50 miles per hour? Yes, just disappeared back into the trees. Donahue set down his pen and looked at me directly. Ms. Reynolds, I appreciate you coming in. We take all wildlife reports seriously. But you don't believe me. He didn't answer immediately. I believe you experienced something that frightened you. We've had reports of unusual wildlife sightings in that area before. Sasquatch sightings? I asked bluntly. A slight smile crossed his face. I didn't use that term. But others have? He closed his notebook. This isn't the first report we've received describing a large bipedal creature in the forests between here and Lapine. Most can be attributed to bears, especially when seen in poor light conditions or at a distance. This wasn't a bear. My voice hardened. Bears don't run at 45 miles per hour on two legs. Bears don't make direct, sustained eye contact like they're trying to communicate. No, they don't, he agreed quietly. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside the ranger station window, tourists loaded gear into their cars, heading out for hikes or camping trips, blissfully unaware. What happens now? I finally asked. I filed the report. If we get similar reports in the area, we might increase patrols or set up wildlife cameras. So nothing, he sighed. Ms. Reynolds, what would you have us do? Mount a full-scale search for a creature most scientists don't believe exists based on a single sighting. Put that way, it did sound ridiculous. I stood up, suddenly tired. Thanks for your time, Ranger Donahue. He walked me to the door. One more thing, he said, voice lower now. Did anyone else see this creature? Any other cars on the road at the time? There was a truck coming the other way when it was right beside my car. The driver didn't react at all. Donahue nodded slowly. That's consistent with other reports. What do you mean? Just that, well, these creatures, if they exist, seem to be selectively visible somehow. One person sees it, others nearby don't. A chill ran through me. You do believe me. He handed me a card with his number. I believe you believe, Miss Reynolds. And I've worked these forests for 23 years. There are things out there I can't explain. He glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. My advice, don't drive that stretch of road alone at dusk anymore. I stayed with my sister in Chiloquin for 2 more weeks. I made excuses about wanting to spend more time with her kids, but the truth was, I couldn't face that drive back home, not yet. Beth noticed something was wrong, but didn't push when I deflected her questions. When I finally did drive back north, I left at 10 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. I drove with all the windows up and doors locked, radio off so I could hear any sound outside the car. As I approached the stretch of highway where it had happened, my palms began to sweat. My heart hammered against my ribs. I drove straight through without stopping, going exactly the speed limit, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Nothing happened. No massive shape emerged from the forest. No amber eyes met mine. Just trees and asphalt and the occasional passing car. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. 4 months have passed since my encounter on Highway 97. I've moved from Bend to Eugene, telling everyone it was for a job opportunity. The real reason is that I couldn't stand living so close to those forests anymore. I've driven that highway exactly once since the incident, in the middle of the day, with my brother-in-law in the passenger seat. I still see those eyes when I try to sleep. Still feel that moment of connection with something that shouldn't exist. I've researched online, finding communities of people with similar experiences. Some say Sasquatch are peaceful forest dwellers, curious but shy. Others paint them as territorial predators. Neither description matches what I felt in that creature's gaze. It wasn't peaceful curiosity I saw in those amber eyes. It wasn't simple predatory hostility either. It was recognition, as if it knew exactly what I was and was deciding something about me, judging me. Last week, I received a voicemail from Ranger Donahue. Ms. Reynolds, just wanted to let you know we've had 2 more reports similar to yours on that same stretch of Highway 97. If you're willing to talk again, call me back. I haven't called him back. I'm not sure I will. Part of me wants to know if the other witnesses felt what I felt, that terrible moment of being seen, truly seen, by something ancient and intelligent that doesn't appear in any biology textbook. The other part of me wants to forget it ever happened, to convince myself it was stress or fatigue or a momentary hallucination. But every night, as I'm falling asleep, I remember the steam rising from its body in the cold air, the bunching of muscles under that matted hair, the deliberate way it bent down to look at me, and I know with absolute certainty that somewhere in those dense Oregon forests it remembers me too. Story 15. My hands still shake when I write this. Been 3 days since I made it back to the trading post, and I still wake up screaming. Doc says it's the shock, that I need rest. But rest brings dreams, and in my dreams they're still chasing me. I'm Harry Culp, been prospecting in Alaska for 17 years now, seen things most folks wouldn't believe. 800-pound bears, wolves the size of calves, storms that could strip the paint off a house. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered at Thomas Bay. It started simply enough. I'd heard rumors of gold deposits near Half Moon Lake, about 6 miles inland from Thomas Bay. Nothing spectacular, but enough to warrant investigation. I packed light, my pan, shovel, rifle, bedroll, 2 weeks of provisions, and my mapping tools. The canoe ride from Juneau was uneventful, just me and the water and the endless sky. Thomas Bay welcomed me with perfect weather. Unusual for October in southeast Alaska, but I took it as a good sign. I beached my canoe on a pebbled shore, secured it above the tide line, and made camp that first night without incident. The next morning broke clear and cold. I checked my compass and began the hike inland, following a game trail that wound through dense spruce forest. The ground was soft, spongy with moss and fallen needles. My boots sank slightly with each step, making the going slower than I'd like. By midday, I'd climbed about 2,000 feet in elevation, and the trees began to thin. I reached the ridge above Half Moon Lake around 3 in the afternoon. The view stopped me cold, not with fear, not yet, but with its sheer magnificence. Frederick Sound stretched out below me, its water a deep slate blue. Cape of the Straight Light was visible to the southeast, and far in the distance, the humped shadow of Kodiak Island. The lake itself was a perfect half-moon shape, nestled in the valley below my position, its water so clear I could see rocks on the bottom, even from my elevated perch. I took out my notebook and began jotting down landmarks, marking potential survey sites. The wind picked up slightly, bringing with it the scent of pine and wet earth. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how right I felt in that moment. 17 years in this territory, and still the beauty of it could stop my breath. I checked my watch. Still enough daylight to scout a bit more before making camp. I turned to get bearings on a series of mountain peaks to my north. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought they were bears. 3 dark shapes moving up the ridge from the direction of the lake. But bears don't walk upright. Not like these things did. I reached for my binoculars, hands already unsteady. Through the lenses, I saw them clearly, and my mouth went dry as dust. They weren't men, weren't animals either. They walked on 2 legs, but hunched forward, with long arms that nearly dragged on the ground. Their bodies, God help me, their bodies were covered in coarse, dark hair, matted in places. But that wasn't the worst of it. Where the hair didn't grow, their skin was visible, but it wasn't skin like you or I have. It was raw, covered in weeping sores and scabs that oozed a yellowish fluid. I lowered the binoculars, hoping they'd disappear, hoping they were just a trick of light or fatigue. But they were still there, closer now, moving with a purpose directly toward my position. That's when the smell hit me. Even from 50 yards away, the stench reached me. Rotting meat, infected wounds, and something else, something chemical and wrong. My stomach heaved, and I tasted bile at the back of my throat. One of them stopped, raised its head, and looked directly at me. Its face, I struggle to describe it even now. The features were almost human, but twisted, wrong. The eyes were too large, too far apart. The mouth was wide, lipless, filled with teeth that seemed randomly placed, some long, some broken. No nose, just 2 slits where a nose should be. It opened its mouth and made a sound, not a roar, not a scream, a high-pitched keening that raised every hair on my body. The other 2 joined in, creating a chorus that hurt my ears and scrambled my thoughts. Then they charged. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced them with courage, but that would be a lie. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I fumbled for my rifle, raised it to my shoulder and pulled the trigger. Click! The firing pin struck, but nothing happened. I worked the bolt, tried again. Nothing. The damn thing had gotten wet somewhere along the way. Useless. They were 30 yards away now, moving fast. Those long arms reaching forward, fingers splayed. I could see those fingers clearly. Too long, too many joints, ending in curved, yellowed claws. I threw the rifle at the lead creature. It bounced off its chest without slowing it down. I turned and ran. The ridge sloped down toward the north, away from the lake. I took it at a dead sprint, boots sliding on loose shale, arms pinwheeling for balance. Behind me, the keening grew louder, closer. The smell intensified, so strong I could taste it. I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were faster than they looked, gaining on me with each stride. The lead creature, I can't call it a man, won't call it a man, was barely 10 feet behind me. The ground leveled briefly before dropping away into a steeper descent. I used the flat section to push myself harder, legs burning, lungs heaving. The forest line was ahead, maybe 200 yards. If I could reach the trees, maybe I could lose them, climb something, hide. A hot breath on my neck. The stench was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. Something scraped across my back. One of those clawed hands tearing through my jacket, missing my skin by a thickness of fabric. I screamed, couldn't help it. The sound tore from my throat without conscious thought. The trees were closer now, 100 yards, 50. I heard them right behind me, their breathing, ragged, wet sounds coming from their throats. My foot caught a rock. I pitched forward, arms outstretched, certain this was the end. I hit the ground hard, rolled, somehow got back to my feet. The momentum carried me the last few yards to the tree line. Once among the trees, I didn't slow down. I ducked under branches, leaped over fallen logs, changed direction randomly. The creatures crashed through the forest behind me, breaking branches, howling that terrible sound. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, time lost meaning. There was only the forest, my burning legs, and the terror pushing me forward. Eventually I realized I couldn't hear them anymore. I stopped, bent double, hands on knees, gulping air. My back stung where the creature's claws had torn my jacket. When I reached back, my fingers came away sticky with blood. Not much, just scratches, but enough to remind me this wasn't a nightmare. This was happening. I stayed there, listening. Forest sounds slowly returned. Wind in the branches, a distant bird call, no keening, no crashing through undergrowth. Had I lost them? The light was fading. Dusk comes early in Alaska in October, and I'd been running west, away from my camp, away from my canoe. I was lost, weaponless, with night coming on. I needed to move, to put more distance between myself and those things, but my legs shook with exhaustion. I forced myself upright, picked a direction, east, I hoped, and started walking. Each step was an effort. My boots felt filled with lead. The forest grew darker. I strained my eyes, trying to see obstacles before I tripped over them. The temperature dropped rapidly, as it does in the northern wilderness after sunset. My sweat-soaked clothes began to chill against my skin. A sound to my right stopped me cold. A branch breaking, something moving. I froze, held my breath. Seconds ticked by, another sound, closer, a soft huffing like an animal scenting prey. They'd found me. I backed away slowly, one step, two. My heel hit something solid, a tree trunk. I felt behind me, confirming its shape, then began to edge around it. A shape moved in the gloom ahead, not human, not animal, something in between. It was one of them, moving parallel to my position, head swinging from side to side as it searched. I pressed myself against the tree, tried to make myself smaller, invisible. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain the creature would hear it. It stopped, raised its head, those horrible nostrils flaring. It was scenting me. The wind shifted slightly, blowing from me to it. It turned directly toward me. Even in the near darkness, I could see the gleam of its eyes, the shine of fluid on its sores. I ran. Blind panic now. No direction, no plan. Just away from that thing. Branches whipped my face. I crashed through underbrush, stumbled over unseen obstacles. Behind me, the keening started again, joined by others. All three were on me. The forest ended abruptly. I burst out into open space, momentum carrying me forward before I realized, too late, that the ground dropped away sharply. I was running off a cliff. My feet left solid earth. For one suspended moment I hung in space, arms windmilling uselessly. Then gravity claimed me. I fell. How far, I don't know. Far enough for the wind to rush past my ears, for my stomach to lurch into my throat. Not far enough to kill me. I hit water, Half Moon Lake, I realized dimly, and went under. The cold was a shock, driving the air from my lungs. I fought to the surface, gasping. The water was deep here, close to the cliff face. I treaded water, looking up. Dark shapes moved at the edge of the cliff above. The creatures paced back and forth, their keening carrying clearly across the open space. They didn't follow me down. I swam. The shore wasn't far, maybe 30 yards. My waterlogged clothes dragged at me, but fear gave me strength. I reached shallow water, dragged myself onto rocky ground and collapsed. I must have passed out. Exposure, shock, exhaustion, any or all of them took me down into darkness. When I came to, grey dawn light filtered through a heavy mist. I was shivering uncontrollably, my clothes still wet, my body temperature dangerously low. I had to move or die. I forced myself to my feet. Everything hurt. My back throbbed where the creature's claws had caught me. My face was cut from branches, my hands scraped raw from my fall. I knew the lake's shape from my earlier vantage point. If I followed the shoreline south, I should eventually hit the stream that fed into Thomas Bay. Follow that, and I'd reach my canoe. I started walking. Each step was agony, but I kept going. The mist clung to the lake surface, reducing visibility to a few yards. Good. It would hide me. Bad. I couldn't see if the creatures were still hunting me. The morning wore on. The mist began to thin as the sun rose higher. I kept to the lake shore, one foot in front of the other, mechanically moving forward. By midday, I found the stream. Relief made me dizzy. I was on the right track. I picked up my pace, following the water's course downstream. The journey back is a blur in my memory. Pain, fear, exhaustion. Constantly looking over my shoulder, starting at every sound. The stream widened as it neared the bay. Familiar landmarks appeared, and then suddenly there it was, the pebbled beach where I'd left my canoe. The sight nearly broke me. I stumbled the last 100 yards, fell to my knees beside the canoe, pressed my forehead against its solid wooden side. Safe. I was safe. I pushed the canoe into the water with the last of my strength, climbed in, grabbed the paddle. My arms felt like rubber, but fear drove me. I had to get away from this place. I paddled straight out into Thomas Bay. No real destination in mind, just away. The water was calm, the sky clear. A perfect day for canoeing, a mockery of the horror I'd just experienced. I don't remember much after that. Shock setting in, probably. I have vague impressions of paddling until my arms wouldn't move anymore, of drifting, of the sun setting and rising again. A fishing boat found me somewhere between Thomas Bay and Kodiak Island. Delirious, dehydrated, my wounds infected. They brought me to the trading post at Port Alexander. Doc Simmons cleaned me up, gave me antibiotics, tried to get me to eat. They asked me what happened. I tried to tell them, saw the disbelief in their eyes. Shock, they said. Hallucinations, maybe a bear attack that my mind transformed into something more fantastic. But I know what I saw, know what chased me. The devils of Thomas Bay. The creatures that aren't men, aren't animals, but something in between, something wrong. I'm leaving as soon as I can travel, going back to Tacoma, maybe farther south, somewhere without wilderness, without mountains, without dark forests where things can hide. Don't go to Thomas Bay, don't climb to Half Moon Lake. What lives there isn't natural, isn't right. And if you hear stories about old Harry Culp losing his mind in the Alaskan wilderness, maybe pause before you dismiss them. Some horrors can't be explained away. Some nightmares follow you into the waking world, and some places should be left alone.